Well, hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be on board of this wonderful conference. And after yesterday's very interesting talks and fascinating keynote lecture in the evening, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Bastien and Müge, joining us from Liège and Istanbul, respectively, on today's more literary session. And without further ado, I would like to ask Bastien to give us his presentation on imagining queer futures, post-colonial utopias of desires in Trinidadian writing.
Thank you so much, Aran. I'm going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint here. Okay. Do not hesitate to interrupt me if you can't see it or if there's a problem. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Yeah.
I might interrupt you if you should not keep time well, but I
agree
there won't be a problem.
Should be 20 minutes. So okay. Thank you very much. I would like to thank also, of course, Derek and Ramzi for this amazing event. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very happy to have you here to listen to my research. So I would like to start by saying that more than after 500 years after Thomas More's literary depiction of utopia, so it is an untraceable island inhabited by a perfect society. Well, I think that the idealists among us keep longing for a utopian place where social inequities cease to exist. So I think that turning our gaze today to utopia, to this concept, is very important, especially at the moment, these times of maybe despair. So I'm about to discuss the representations of queer utopias by writers from the Caribbean island of Trinidad and the diaspora. However, of course, my aim is not to romanticize the Caribbean, nor to reinforce the neo-colonial imaginary of an exotic paradise that is commonly portrayed in the global north. Rather, this paper, I think, attempts to destabilize the Eurocentric dynamics that often neglect the production of queer knowledge from the global south. In Imperial Desire, Sexual Utopias, M. Jackie Alexander, who is a Trinidadian lesbian feminist, she foregrounds the ways in which dominant queer theorizing in the global north has had, and I quote, the effect of constructing queer theory in a way that eviscerates histories of colonialism and racial formation. So in light of Alexander's statement, this paper sheds light on alternative understandings of being, feeling, and doing queerness, and that participate in the dismantling of spatiotemporal oppositions that characterize neo-colonial binary thinking. So today there is this representation of a civilized, modern, pro-LGBTQI global north opposed to a violent, backward, anti-LGBTQI global south. So I think that queer Trinidadian writings actively trouble such dichotomies by simultaneously challenging local cis-heterosexism as much as they defy external homonationalist agendas. The future is commonly understood in terms of progress, that is, a representation from and by the global north that reflects a linear conception of time, so past, present, future. And this is translated into special cultural and racial categorizations. And in the colonial enterprise, the future of imperialist expansion trumps the past and the present. Rachel Fox writes that, I quote, the future consumed the colonizers' understanding of the world, leaving them to see themselves and the world around them in retrospect as something that happened on the way to their utopia. So the colonizers' unidirectional turn towards the future not only serve the purpose of legitimizing the atrocities committed committed against the colonized, but it also engages with the invisibilizations of racist oppression in the past and the present. So nowadays, the presence of the formerly colonized non-white racial other in the global north is depicted by some as an obstacle to progress. And for example, in White Innocence, Gloria Wecker discusses the anti-immigration and racist rhetoric adopted by some white Dutch gays who bemoan the time, and I quote, when the inexorable march of progress towards sexual liberation could proceed without being hampered by uncivilized others. The colonial representation of temporal progress has pervasive effects in the present, namely in its distortions of the past. In One-Dimensional Queer, Roderick E. Ferguson reveals how the anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and anti-cis-heterosexist thinking that originally animated the Stonewall riots in the United States has more often than not been silenced. Ferguson's critique excavates a buried part of queer memory, and one that is multidimensional and coalitional. And this echoes what Wecker calls critical nostalgia. So a type of nostalgia that longs, and I quote, for a time when there was critical reflection and action upon the question of which alliances could be made between different categories of minority groups, migrants and gays, hetero women and lesbians. Ferguson's and Wecker's discussions both refer to a past that needs to be acknowledged for the future. And in other words, memory encapsulates the potentialities of a queer utopian future. Ferguson's and Wecker's analysis, which are located in the global north here, dismantle contemporary whitewashings of queer memory and suggest a non-linear representation of progress. And in a similar way, queer images emanating from the global south are crucial, for they can actively help to imagine better anti-colonial, anti-racist queer futures. Let's turn to José Esteban Muñoz's theory now. I know that we mentioned it yesterday. So José Esteban Muñoz is a queer of color theorist of Cuban origin, and he builds on queer spatiotemporalities that promise better futures. He follows a methodology that he calls critical idealism, and he states, and I quote, queerness is not yet here. Queerness is an ideality. Put another way, we are not yet queer. We may never touch queerness, but we can feel it as a warm illumination of a horizon imbued with potentiality. So according to Muñoz, queerness is directed towards the future, is an invitation to keep going towards the horizon while remaining conscious that we will most probably never touch it. More importantly, Muñoz argues that the ideality of queerness follows, and I quote, a temporal arrangement in which the past is a field of possibility in which subjects can act in the present in the service of a new futurity. So utopian queerness draws attention to the potential coalitions and realities that arose in the past, that still arise in the present, that keep on being threatened and made invisible by dominant normative understandings of genders and sexualities. Muñoz, so he suggests another mode of longing that is mediated through desire. It is a form of desire that is, and I quote, always directed at that thing that is not yet here, objects and moments that burn with anticipation and promise. So these objects and moments can be traced, I think, in the reviving representations of past and present queer effects, and namely in the realm of the imagination. The arts can serve as catalyzers of hope that reevaluate the past and the present to turn our gaze toward the queer horizon. Muñoz states that, I quote, the anticipatory illumination of art can be characterized as the process of identifying certain properties that can be detected in representational practices, helping us to see the not yet conscious that is knowable to some extent as a utopian feeling. So as I said in this paper, queer Trinidadian fiction is regarded as one of these potential windows that can be looked through in order to perceive such utopian feelings. And with a past marked by colonialism, racism, slavery, indentureship, and subsequent diaspora, Caribbean and Trinidadian literature particularly reflects the transformative power that a utopian literary critique can provide. Bill Ashcroft writes, "The strategies developed in the Caribbean to reshape self and society, strategies based on a critique of the history of slavery and its consequences, offer some of the most powerful examples of utopian thinking by enacting a belief in radical transformation. This belief results in a demonstration of political resistance as it has always been most effective in post-colonial literature, transformative, innovative, and future thinking. The scope of Trinidadian literature's critique derives from a multidimensional stance that often denounces colonialism, racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia. And being part of a decolonized Caribbean discourse, as Ronald Cumming writes, queer Trinidadian fiction offers alternative solidarity politics and practices that are made significant locally and globally." Let's turn now to Ingrid's Prose, Love After Love. So this is a novel that propels us into the lives of three Indo-Trinidadian characters, Betty, Mr. Chetan, and Solo. And the narrative shifts between spaces, Trinidad and Tobago and the United States, as well as between times, the character's childhood and adulthood. And the novel alternatively features each of the three characters' perspective and experience of sexism, racism, and/or homophobia. And in the first chapter, the reader learns about Betty's murder of her husband, an abusive alcoholic man who used to beat her and their son Solo. After learning, when he's a teenager, he learns about his mother's secret murder, and he decides to fly to New York to start a new life. And eventually, he becomes a disillusioned, illegal immigrant. While Betty's and Solo's conflictual relationship lasts up till the ending of the novel, Chetan, who is Betty's lodger and closeted gay best friend, tries to act as a mediator between the two. And throughout the novel, the three characters struggle with their own experience of oppression, of course, but they also present moments that encapsulate hope for the future and that, to a certain extent, express a queer utopian feeling. And I would like to discuss two episodes of Chetan's perspective, in which one can spot Munoz's anticipatory illumination of queerness. The first passage in question deals with Chetan's trip to the Maracas Bay and features one of his public sex experiences with another man to whom he refers as the brown sugar god. So the pseudonym here echoes the histories of slaves and plantations in Trinidad, implying that the man in question is a local queer man rather than a white tourist, for example. So we are dealing here with local queerness. And although Chetan tries to repress his desires because of society's homophobia, public sex with other men actually provide him with a sense of self, as we can perceive, for example, in the following passage, and I quote, "Feeling alive, no, feeling anything at all, is mainly a few intense, crazy minutes in a restroom, in the grocery or the mall. When I think of it like that, it doesn't seem worth it. Yet, it's those few moments when I'm complete, the whole me." So as Chetan follows the brown sugar god into a public changing facility at the beach to initiate their sexual intercourse, Chetan starts to feel, and I quote, "fear, anticipation, and horniness surging through his veins." But keeping in mind Munoz's statement that hope, along with its other fear, are effective structures that can be described as anticipatory, I argue that this episode reflects a utopian effect that is directed toward the imminent future of possible desire. So this queer feeling is enabled by a spatial and temporal equation, because it is 8 a.m. at the beach, there's no one, and this allows non-normative sexual explorations. And after the erotic episode, Chetan reflects, if things were different, I would have thanked him for making me feel unbroken, unmarked, not here, and not to a strange manufactured in a public facility. Instead, we showered quickly. A man burst in, that was close. Talk about perfect timing and a whole heap of luck. So while Chetan's thoughts relate to a utopian queer effect, his remarks also suggest that hetero and homonormative respectability invades the queer reparative space. This is not only made evident in his internalized shame regarding public sexuality, but it is also materialized by this appearing man who looks at him with disdain. In a similar way, when Chetan leaves the changing facility, he notes that, I quote, life was stirring on the beach. A young family arrived and set out their chairs and picnicked within my canopy of coconut trees. So the contrast between the queer hidden space of earlier and the heteronormative life outside leads Chetan to long for heteronormativity. Heteronormativity is actually the supposedly only accessible promise of happiness. And he tries to convince himself that this will be possible with Betty and Solo. He says, we'll be a family, a real family that will make up for everything. Later in the novel, the family portrait that Chetan dreams of is almost concretized, namely in a scene where Chetan is reunited with his youth lover, Mani, and shares a meal with him and Betty. And the meaning of family here is reconfigured and takes a queer form in the sense that the characters are not linked by blood or marriage, but rather by a communal feeling of love, desire, and care. Solo, who has left Trinidad for several years and is still in conflict with his mother, is the only thing that is missing for Chetan. And by stating that if he was sitting here, the moment would be perfect, Chetan gazes at the queer illumination of what their future could be. Chetan intuitively sends a phone text to Solo to invite him to come to Trinidad for Christmas, to which Solo replies, we'll think about it, possible. The reader then anticipates the formation of a queer family and realizes the full potential that resides in this moment. This hope for the future, however, is shattered in the following chapters when Chetan's perspective abruptly disappears. Munoz writes that utopian feelings can and regularly will be disappointed. They are nonetheless indispensable to the act of imaging transformation. So despite the tragic turn of event that is of Chetan being killed by a homophobic man, while Love After Love invites its readers to glimpse at the potentialities of queerness and perhaps to imagine an alternative ending, an alternative future that includes the reunion of the three protagonists. Let's turn now to Anton Niblet's short story collection, Now After. So there's one narrative in particular that deals with the reimagining of the future from the queer angle. Argument against making heterosexuality illegal is stylistically presented as a newspaper article set in 2077, in which a journalist attempts to convince the reader that the criminalization of heterosexuality in Trinidad and Tobago would not be desirable. So the narrative presents some queer utopian characteristics, namely in its normativization of queerness. I quote, notice that while we casually champion homosexuality as a ubiquitous ideal, there are still a few souls among us, old enough to remember a time before the term even existed, before we rescued the root sex from archaic static prefixes of homo, bi, and hetero, or even cis or non-binary, retrofitting it with the Latin prefix for together. So Trinidad, sorry, I forgot to, okay. So Trinidad and Tobago becomes, and I quote, a glowing example of success on the world stage, and the positioning of homosexuality above all other sexualities seems to represent a queer ideal. However, the arguments in favor of the criminalization of heterosexuality, to which the narrator here is opposed, suggest otherwise. To tolerate, encourage, they say, a radical fringe who insist on the practice of heterosexuality is to open the door to danger and destruction. It is objected that allowing space for the ongoing practice of heterosexuality endangers our children, and they will take up that practice, and that thing you know, heterosexual will be everywhere. So such stigmatization of heterosexuality explicitly echoes the arguments that were and are used against non-normative genders and sexualities in the readers present, so both in Trinidad and Tobago and elsewhere. And the queer future that at first sight seems to be utopian turns out to serve as a critique of the reader's present. So that this is a future world that contains this present and consequently is not yet utopian. Instead of considering heterosexuality as archaic, the columnist looks at their past and at the materialization of queer thinking in their present, in the achievements that they, as a nation, have encompassed. We Trimbagonians have left behind cruel and divisive understanding of race and sex based on rigid binaries. We are Trimbagonians functioning across a spectrum of engagements with self and others. It's hard for us to embrace a minority among us who hold insistently to the archaic fixedness of heterosexuality. Still, I argue that their very existence poses no threat to the population at large. I argue we can make space for them without the strength of our society. We need no fear. So the arguments that are raised by the journalists are reminiscent of queer of color anti-colonial theorizations, that these are not yet fully realized in our present. And so the journalist depiction of these achievements in their past and present come to the reader as the future past, so the queer illumination of utopia. And the arguments in favor of heterosexuality are directed toward a non-queer present, are really in favor of contemporary non-normative genders and sexualities. And despite its optimistic tone, the text also warns the reader against the annihilation of difference and invites them to advance together with empathy towards the future, while always remembering in which position they are now. In conclusion, Trinidadian queer imaginings of utopia challenge hetero and homonormativity, neo-colonialism, and offer visions of what queerness could be, both in Trinidad, in the Caribbean, and elsewhere. In his analysis of the unsprung in Another Place Not Here, a novel that deals with a relationship of love and desire between two Trinidadian women, Ronald Cummings writes that Munoz and Brandt's Not Yet Here queerness propels us to explore, I quote, utopian longings for other kinds of collectives, formations, relationships, and therefore of communal, political, and intimate belonging. And as I have argued, this is reflected in Prose's and Nimblet's works as well. They inform us that this utopia is on the horizon, not on an island, neither it is on a self-congratulating homonationalist state. The potentialities of queerness are there within desires. Thank you.
Thank you, Bastien. Many thanks for this interesting talk, taking us far away from the here and now and removing us from the current order, inverting everything. I'm sure there will be some questions for you, maybe in the chat or later on in not real life, live on air, I guess.
Okay, so next we will be hearing from Kaustav Bakshi, who's assistant professor in the Department of English at Jadavpur University in Kolkata, India, and who will be speaking to us today about making sense of queerness before the advent of theory. Kaustav?
Hello, everyone. It's evening here. It may be morning there. So very good evening to everybody. And also a huge thank you to Ramsey and Derek for giving me the opportunity to present at this very prestigious conference. I am really fascinated by the interactions that we are having over the last 2 days. I'll be speaking about a novel which has not been translated into English at all. I am trying to do that, but I'm finding it difficult to translate because I understood that after a point that it is untranslatable from Bangla. because it uses, dialects and you can say broken, unknown, a kind of a language which is not very familiar to the polite bourgeois English-educated Calcuttan. It is very difficult to translate the novel, but nonetheless, I'm trying. The novel has not been translated. It looks like this is the novel. It's called Maya Mridongo. I'm trying to show it to you. I don't know whether, is it kind of, the mirror image of it is coming perhaps. This is called Maya Mridongo by Said Mustafa Siraj. So this presentation proposes to visit this novel, which was written in 1972 by Said Mustafa Siraj, which has emerged as an important text in the Bengali queer landscape in recent years, with the LGBTQ+ movement taking root in India. The novel is set in rural Bengal of the 1950s and was published at a time when there was little or no awareness of non-binary ways of understanding sexuality. Although there was a familiarity with the Tritiya Prakriti is roughly translated into English as third gender, which Gaurav was talking about yesterday, mostly understood in relation to the presence of the Hijra community in India, there were no scientific or political discourses on gender queerness as such. Said Mustafa Siraj's novel, which has as its protagonist a female impersonator, locally known as Chokra, of an itinerant theatre group called Al-Kap, which traveled through rural Bengal and parts of Bihar, now Jharkhand, I'm talking about Eastern India, locate sexuality and sexual desire in the enigmatic and sometimes impossible to intellectualize realm of Maya. This is the term Maya, which is the most operative term in my paper, and trying to link this philosophy of Maya taken from the Vedanta to the idea of sexual fluidity. That is what majorly I'm going to do here. Siraj's poetic novel delves into this Maya created on stage by men impersonating women and makes an attempt to decode and explain away this puzzle of men falling in love with them despite their knowledge of the reality behind their feminine appearance. The novel, while cursorily drawing from the concept of Maya as understood in ancient Hindu philosophy, progressively becomes denser and nuanced in opening up intriguing debates, which now informs theoretical discourses of gender, sex, sexuality, and the body, albeit in a completely different language. This novel, as I shall argue in its queer affirmativity, provides the current generation of queer individuals in Bengal with a sense of anchor in history and indigenous philosophy, unadulterated by the epistemology of sexuality that has appeared in the recent years. This novel lost in oblivion for several years. The novel was published in 1972, and then for 10 years it was not there. A second edition came out in 1984, but then the novel was completely out of the market. Nobody knew about it. It was brought back in 2004. So the novel itself has its very interesting editorial journey, how it was taken on and off the market. This had nothing to do so much with the novel's queerness, but because it was not given so much importance, that's why the novel was never published. But since 2004, because there is so much awareness surrounding queerness, this novel has been brought back from oblivion. So this novel, lost in oblivion for several years, have gained visibility in recent years when a new edition was brought out. A film was made based on it. I will send a link to a particular clipping from the film later. And a play inspired by it was released for the commercial stage in Kolkata. Ironically, as I shall show, the novel's value as a queer text was realized with the LGBTIQ movement acquiring remarkable visibility in India in recent years, while at the same time, the novel has turned out to be a useful text in countering the dominance of Western theories in a bid to decolonize epistemologies of sexuality. I have given subheadings to my presentation. The first one, gender queerness within the Al-Kap Dol. Dol means group in Maya Mridongo, outside the precincts of bourgeois propriety. It's important to locate it outside bourgeois propriety, because when I say bourgeois propriety in relation to Bengal, I'm talking about the kind of propriety which the colonial past has kind of imposed on the Bengal gentlefolk. So it is outside that. How is it outside that? Set in the 1950s, a few years after India's independence from the British Raj, Maya Mridongo has as its protagonist female impersonators of an itinerant folk theatre group Alkap, who are known as the Chokras. Chokra, Chhokra, Chokras. And they are defined as men who are not men but women, yet not quite women either. So this is my translation. The Chokras, it should be noted, do not emerge as a separate sexual category, because the term chokra neither gathers any political currency nor is viewed as a biomedical category in need of corrective intervention. For in the 1950s, when the novel is set, there is barely much to refer to, particularly in rural India. The chokra, despite being viewed as an anomaly, a beautiful one at that, is less threatening to the heteropatriarchal assumption of sex, gender, and the body. Today, any female impersonator or a drag artist is unquestioningly branded as trans or queer, whether the person self-identifies as one or not, locating them within the discursive field of sexuality identity politics, which paradoxically, while liberating the gender nonconformist individual, has also trapped them into identity boxes. No matter how extensive, expansive, and anti-binary the term queer is, even it has increasingly emerged as an identity category, faithfully to express a non-identitarian stance. The chokra is not an identity category at all, with an unequivocal association of sexuality. It is a performative category, a particular category of actors who are trained, tutored, and made to perform female roles on stage with unique talent of generating Maya. Who are these chokras? They were central to the Alkab Dal, its greatest attraction. The price of a particular group depended on its chokra's beauty, charm, singing, and dancing expertise, that is, his potential of generating Mohini Maya, or hypnotizing spell on the audience. Could every good-looking boy qualify as a chokra? No. There had to be some natural physical characteristics in the boy which, when recognized as befitting a chokra by experienced ustads or mentors, that latter trained and molded him into one. Chokras were literally coached into cultivating their femininity, provided he had enough raw material in him to enable that pruning. This tutoring was not only physical but psychological too, accomplished through socializing the chokra in a certain way that he was made to imagine himself as a woman. What was this raw material the mentors looked for? A particular body type, fair, curvaceous, with thick lips, small forehead, and large eyes. All of these were preferable in the boy, who could be then potentially trained into becoming a chokra. And the boy had to be between, say, 11 and 13. Overall, the boy had to have an identifiable femininity in his gait, gestures, and way of talking. The manner in which this femininity in young boys is rationalized is very intriguing, because within the novel, because rather than judging it by the naturalized codes of masculinity and femininity inextricably attached to the biological body, it is viewed as difference, as a rare phenomenon, a uniqueness that defies any satisfactory explanation. Ustad Jhaksa, mentor Jhaksa, for example, compares the chokra with the moon. And I quote, "Just as the moon makes the night beautiful, the chokra makes Alka beautiful. Men, but not quite men, women, but not women either, then what? Just like the moon. It does not have its own light, yet brags of its beauty, which is but an effect of borrowed light. Then who is the sun if they are the moons? The Ustad himself, the mentor, he who knows how to bring out the chokra's feminine glow and charm. But despite this rare expertise, the mentor cannot explain why men get attracted to the chokras in spite of knowing they are men. why he himself finds it difficult to live without them, despite having polygamous marital relations with women. His answer is very elusive, but very intriguing. He says, it's Maya, it's deep philosophy. The homeopathic doctor, Nani Babu, another character, agrees on meeting Shanti, one of the mentor's beloved chokras. He compares him to a kinnor. He says, you are a kinnor incarnate. You are not human. You cannot be one, at least not in this incarnation. And let me tell you, kinnor is actually a word which is associated with gender fluid divine characters who used to please the gods by their dancing and singing. So they belonged to the heavens and they danced and sang to please the gods. So the boy who performs on stage is compared to the kinnor of Hindu mythology, and it's explained that way. There is no other biomedical or scientific or gendered category here. It is understood in terms of mythology and common sense. In their explanation, Ustad Jhaksa and the homeopathic doctor do not take recourse to an empirical discourse, biomedical or psychiatric. Their elucidation is intuitive, partly based on myth, partly on common sense, in which they do not see the chokra's femininity as a disjuncture or a lack, but as Maya, much of which is unintelligible to the mortals. It is somewhat similar to Leopold Segner's delineation of the African way of apprehending the world as a sensory field which Africans do not analyze but feels through the touch, through instinct. The Kepes, the members of the Al-Qabdal, are known as, when not so completely culturally and cerebrally colonized the way the Bhadralok or the bourgeois gender folk in Bengal was. The Al-Qabdal and its art and lifestyle were still unrefined by colonial education and aesthetics. Their understanding of the universe was still informed by nature, intuitions, and very deep sensory experiences. The composition of the Al-Qab groups, as underlined by Jhaksas, was a mix of Hindus and Muslims, mostly coming from subaltern classes or Dalit classes, such as Chai and Bagri, which did not always speak the refined language used by the Bhadralok class. This is exactly why I am finding it difficult to translate the novel. The viewership mostly consisted of poor peasants and laborers, predominantly men. The novel reiterates the Bhadralok studied distance from Al-Qab, which they look down upon as morally debasing and vulgar. When Shonatan Master, modeled on the author himself, joins the Al-Qabdal, one of the female impersonators, who is also the protagonist, Shuborno, rebukes him. He tells him, you do not fit into Al-Qab, hinting at his bourgeois polish, which is completely out of place. The Kepes were also outside the law in their disregard for the monogamous family. Ustad Jhaksa, for example, has 3 wives, among which his chokras Shufal, Shanti or Shuborno also had a special place, sometimes provoking jealousy in the wives, but nonetheless they cohabited. On the other hand, random sexual intimacies in the Al-Qabdals were also commonplace, as insinuated at but not delineated in details. In any case, the fact that the people belonging to the Al-Qabdal were clearly outside the Bhadralok bracket or the gentlefolk bracket, resisting its ideas of decorum and morality, was one of the primary reasons behind their easy acceptance of gender fluidity as epitomized by the chokras. On the other hand, the obsession with the chokras within Al-Qabdals from a Bhadralok perspective was just another brazen manifestation of their perversity. The next part of the presentation I have titled is Art as an Enabler of Gender Queerness, the Maya Mridongo of the Chokras. Even though Maya Mridongo has its moments of panic for gender queerness, the tone of the narration, the philosophical reflections the characters engage with, and the narrative resolution of the conflicts arising out of Shonatan Master's relationship with Shuborno, all of this work together to create empathy towards the chokra, the genderqueer figure, a kind of empathy only art can afford to produce. In Maya Mridongo, Siraj balances empathy in erotica in an intriguing way whereby the chokra acquires respect in the eyes of the reader. In this connection, it will be useful to decode the title of the novel. Why is it called Maya Mridongo? Mridongo is a musical instrument, a clay tabor that accompanies musical and dance performances in Bengal. But Siraj codes the word with a deeper meaning. Mridongo is a compound word, splits into mrit. Mrit means clay or earth, and ongo. Ongo means limb or body part or the body itself. Literally, mridongo connotes a body of clay. So a lump of clay can be molded into any shape the artisan wishes to, but the object created has a limited life. It is fragile, vulnerable, and transient. So is the chokra. He is molded into a woman, literally constructed as one, the artisan being the mentor or the ustad. The chokra's artistic life as female impersonator demands of him to suppress his masculinity almost to the extent of forgetting he was a man once. The artistic device which generates this maya or illusion on stage by convincingly transforming men into women also conditions the subjects, the chokras, which this device uses as raw material or mrit or earth, into believing in this maya, that they are women. So much so that once the performance is over, it is impossible to return to being men anymore. At least this is what happens with Shuborno, the protagonist of the novel. The question remains, had not Shuborno been fashioned into a chokra by an external agency such as his ustad, would Shuborno still be homosexually inclined? It is difficult to tell. The novel does not even try to answer this question. Rather, it seems to suggest there could not be any real or inherent identity at all. In this connection, the novel's repeated emphasis on Maya becomes loaded with meaning. This is exactly where art, the Alka performances, and the novel itself, which depicts them, becomes an enabler of gender queerness at multiple levels. I am trying to decode the term Maya in three phases now. First, Maya as pleasure. At one level, Maya is pleasurable illusion generated by mimetic art, which mesmerizes the audience into taking for real which is not real, opening up some deep recesses of desire which the audience was not even aware of before coming in contact with the Alka performance. This in turn explains the chokra's desirability among his male audience as well as co-artists. David Cressy in 1996, commenting on the overt homoeroticism of the Elizabethan playhouse in London involving boy actors and male audiences, sees this illusion equivalent to Maya in Siraj's text frequently evokes, created on stage as pleasurable only because it allows unopposed entry into a sexually charged subculture of transgression, which is otherwise a taboo or beyond the cognizance of the conscious mind, interpolated in a binary structure of understanding sexuality and desire. The Puritan deprecation of the Elizabethan stage in several pamphlets, which is now read as homophobic, was actually a manifestation of the anxiety of this act of transgression in which the audience participated, enabled by the art or trickery, which is called karchupi or trickery in Siraj's text as well. This is similar to Farazi Islamic condemnation of the artifice of art that produces illusion, maya or moha. Moha is hypnotization, which is as grave as sinning against nature. But in case of Jhaksa or Shanaton or Kadir or Nofur, all the characters in the novel, this act of transgression does not end with the end of the act. It continues beyond it. It does not remain a lie, nor an artifice, but becomes a reality. And I quote, "A lie when repeated again and again to oneself becomes the truth at one point in time," unquote. How does one probably explain this? Jhaksa again uses the term Maya or Guccho Tattva. Guccho Tattva means deep philosophy, to make sense of this continuing Maya or Moho of the chokras. Maya as Guccho Tattva or deep philosophy. The Maya or Guccho Tattva, the author and Jhaksa stresses on, could be connected to Shankaracharya's doctrine of Maya, which forms the central tenet of Advaita school of Vedanta. Advaita means non-dualist school of Vedanta. Maya has been variously interpreted, but in the context of this novel, particularly to understand its queer valence, the following definitions seem expedient and in fact comes closest to Siraj's deployment of the term in my understanding. S. Radhakrishnan writes, and I quote, it's a slightly longish quote, just bear with me. The Vedanta system is supposed to be an acosmic pantheism, holding that the absolute called Brahman alone is real and the finite manifestations are illusory. There is one absolute undifferentiated reality, the nature of which is constituted by knowledge. The entire empirical world, with its distinction of finite minds and the objects of their thought, is an illusion. Subjects and objects are like the fleeting images which encompass the dreaming soul and melt away into nothingness at the moment of waking. The term Maya signifies the illusory character of the finite world. This is the basic definition of Maya in Vedantic philosophy. However, this does not simply imply that the world does not exist or it is completely unreal. As Shastri, Vroom, Doniger O'Flaherty, and others have shown, the doctrine of Maya holds that the world is not what it appears to be. It only deceives people about things that they think they know. More basically, it limits their knowledge to things which are epistemologically and ontologically second rate. Again, Gough relates Maya to the unconscious, the indifferent aggregate of all the possibilities of emanatory or derived existence pre-existing with the Brahman. In the text in question, Maya therefore seems to operate on several levels. First, the idea that all identities are after all illusory and ephemeral. Number two, the idea that the truth will be revealed when the veil of ignorance is removed. Now, at a superficial level, it might appear that once the veil of performance is removed, the Chokra's real identity as a man will be revealed when the Maya he has so far conjured on stage is dispelled. But at a deeper level, the novelist seems to suggest that the naturalness of such fixed categories of man and woman, of normal and abnormal, of natural and unnatural, are but an elaborate illusion, not what they appear to be. The truth is something else. It is so vast, so infinite, that it is beyond the intelligibility of the finite mind. Fantasies and desires belonging to the unconscious is impossible to apprehend. The closest the conscious mind could come to elucidate it is understood as Maya. It must be mentioned here that the doctrine of Maya is commonplace knowledge within Indian cultures, and one need not have read the Vedantas to fathom this. Jaksa, who is not institutionally educated but has gained knowledge through experience of the world, has come to develop a perception of Maya in his own way. When the author, the urban educated author, does not try to amplify or substantiate Jaksa's idea of Maya as belonging to a certain school of philosophy, he also deploys Maya as intuitive knowledge gained from experience of profound insight, which all the mentors of Alka were capable of. Shubarna, on the other hand, does not seem to take the assistance of philosophy to make sense of his difference. He is never shown reflecting on Maya, moha, or guilt, unlike the older men. His desires do not trouble him as such. He seems to have come closer to the understanding of Maya without theorizing it. Shubarna's anxiety is not so much related to his desire for the master Shonatan. He is troubled by his difference solely because he has witnessed the tragic predicament of aging Chokras and foresees such a tragic future for himself. He knows he will be abandoned, rendered useless once he outgrows his adolescence. Because there are no affirmative discourses of homosexuality available to him, he knows that there is one normative form of desire, and that is heterosexual, which gets social sanction. In the small, closed, rural world in which he belongs, it is impossible for Shubarna to imagine an alternative life, though the ending of the novel seems to suggest he has got the promise of love. Maya as love, the third phase. The word Maya has other connotations: love, fondness, care, compassion.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, Kaustubh. I just want to make sure we have time for our last presentation and also some open-ended conversation. So is there a way to abbreviate the third movement or phase of your presentation?
I'm just towards the end of it. It's just over now. Okay. I think I was not keeping my eye on the watch.
No.
So in the end of the novel, Shuborno and Shonatan, they come together. It is a happy ending. But the idea is, I'll just sum this up, and if the questions come in, I'm certainly going to answer. So in this paper, I try to achieve two things. By turning to a queer novel set in the 1950s, I tried to create a sense of an alternative history of love and romance, rather than projecting queerness as a symptom of lack or failure, non-being, as Sarah Ahmed legitimizes it. And number two, locating queer feelings within an apparently inviolable structures of compulsory heterosexuality, and showing how such feelings break through normative arrangements of love, romance, and sexual desire in a happy ending. And the most importantly, it creates a text like Maya Mridongo. Although it seems to peddle, a queer love fantasy, it nonetheless creates a pretext under which reality of queer feelings and emotions could be justified and appreciated, when such fantasy is read as history at the present moment in India after the advent of theory, although the novel was written before anybody had any awareness of theory. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christoph, for that riveting presentation. I'm sure there'll be questions that'll let you expand on anything you had to leave out for reasons related to time. And again, so sorry.
Absolutely. I'm very sorry that I was not keeping a...
No, not at all, not at all. Just making sure that we're moving forward, not an especially queer task, I'm afraid, but one that I see as my responsibility. So finally, on this panel, we'll be hearing from Paulina Pajek, who is a lecturer, I hope I'm getting your title right, at the University of Wrocław in Poland. She'll be speaking to us today about forgotten Sapphic myths of Polish modernism. Thank you, Paulina, in advance.
Thank you very much. I will move quickly to the presentation because I think that after such fascinating papers, we would like to discuss them, and there will be probably a lot of questions. So starting immediately with my own paper. In modernity, queer existence has been fragile, precarious, marginalized. Nevertheless, both imaginary and real queer communities have appeared around the world in these rare periods which were relatively free of persecution and extermination. Traces and shadow of many queer communities have been erased from the main currents of history and culture, shattering any possibility of recreating a multifaceted image of a given age. Among these lost fragments, we may find glimpses of Sapphic modernism in Poland. In my paper, I will explore the cultural implication of these Sapphic myths within Polish modernism, focusing on intersectional overlapping of ethnicity, gender, and sexuality, both in this text and in their interwar period and contemporary Polish queer studies reception. Although Polish queer modernism has been mapped, today the field has been dominated by the study of canonical male writers, such as Gombrowicz or Iwaszkiewicz. It has been partially caused by the precarious status of queer studies in Poland. The majority of recent research has been funded by grant projects that focus on masculinity studies. The difference is visible in the most recent publications about the Polish queer modernism, or the published this year, the Anthology of Polish Queer Literature. But still, any attempt at the reconstruction of lesbian or Sapphic modernism in Poland risks a confrontation with a widely held opinion that such a phenomenon has never existed. In 2017, the writer Renata Lis recreated this myth in her essayistic book called Lesbos, a transnational story about the love between artists inspired by Sappho, including Russian Sofia Parnok, Polish Anna Kowalska, and British Janet Winterson. A year after the publication of Lesbos, Lis wrote an essay about the book Genesis, explaining that it tried to fill in numerous painful gaps in Polish culture. As you could see in the quotation on the screen, among absent people and events, she enumerated lesbian modernist literature in Poland, or the monument or icon of the lesbian theme. This belief that Sapphic modernism has never occurred in Poland returns as well in critical works. Though some counter-arguments has been collected within gender and queer studies, researchers still bemoan the lack of Sapphic myths and works within Polish modernism, as you can see in the quotation from the queer literary scholar Tarkowski. The emergence of lesbian themes in Polish prose is typically located no earlier than in the 1990s. And yet, my research shows that openly Sapphic themes emerged in Polish literature in the 1930s, so 60 years earlier than the previously accepted 1990s. And in my paper, I will present 3 Polish modernist texts that offer vast potential for Sapphic myths. Bożeleński's essay, Gabrielar's Romance from 1928, holds The Well of Loneliness with a preface by Krzywicka from 1933, and from the same year, a novel by Maria Motrakovska titled Sanetka. The appearance of novels with Sapphic themes would not have been possible without 3 factors: a favorable legal situation, publishers willing to risk such an endeavor, and liberal and left-wing intellectuals who supported lesbian and proto-queer emancipation. The key factors in the genesis of Sapphic modernism in Poland were then the 1932 reform of the Criminal Code, the activity of various publishers, including Publishing Society Rój. I do not have time, of course, to go into details about these 2 aspects. I will focus instead on the efforts of writers. Tadeusz Bożeleński and Jelena Krzywicka, who in their journalism strive to ameliorate the precarious situation of sexual minorities, as they called them. I will now briefly discuss the publications of these 2 intellectuals, as they are deeply connected to the emergence of Sapphic or lesbian themes in Polish interwar culture. In 1928, John Radcliffe Hall, then an established and popular writer, published The Well of Loneliness, one of the first novels with undisguised lesbian and trans, possibly proto-queer themes. It was both persecuted and praised for its honesty. After the obscenity trial, as you, I'm sure, are familiar with, the book was judged to be not only obscene, but even a danger to nation. Its copies were burned, and it seemed probable that the novel would fall into obscurity. Indeed, The Well was not published in Britain until 1949. But then, as early as 1929, started something very interesting, I think, a movement of transnational solidarity that led to publication of Hall's novel and translation around the world. One of the elements of this movement was the Polish translation. Its origin may be rooted to the December 1928, when the news of Hall's banned novel reached Poland. The news appeared in several dailies, but also socialist newspapers, so it was widely commented. In that very moment, Boy devoted his essay, published in the influential weekly Literary News, to Narcyza Żmichowska, the then half-forgotten writer with the pen name Gabriela, and also one of the founders of the Polish women's rights movement called Enthusiasts. She had been sentenced to prison for her independence activism. Boy composed a versatile portrayal of Żmichowska, including information about her lesbianism and her love for Zbyszewska, encoded as a heterosexual romance in her 1846 novel Poganka, the Hitan, that was wonderfully translated into English a few years ago by Ursula Phillips. So if you are interested, you might have a look. But what is important, Boy presented Żmichowska's patriotism and lesbianism not as mutually exclusive, but as complementary characteristics. Thanks to Boy efforts, including the publication of Żmichowska's uncensored letters, she remains one of a few historical figures whose lesbian or non-heteronormative identity is today not questioned. Of equal importance was Krzywicka's courageous and provocative preface to Hall's The Well of Loneliness. Although Hall's novel is known as the Bible of lesbianism, it explores also trans and pre-queer themes. Like Hall, Krzywicka was influenced by the theory of sexual inversion, very popular in the 1920s, 1930s in Europe. Yet her manifesto included several emancipatory statements that you can see on the screen. She was acknowledging the existence of numerous lesbians, hinting also that she not really like Hall's novel, saying good writers are few, yet lesbians are numerous. She was also arguing that a relationship between 2 women could be considered a common marriage. Krzywicka believed that lesbianism was, quote, love, true love, and demanded a change of attitudes towards people like Stephen, the protagonist of Hall's novel. The implication of Krzywicka's preface for the LGBTQ plus culture in Poland are enormous. When in May 1933, the preface was published as a feature in literary news, both Hall's novel and lesbianism actually made the headlines. But back then, in the 1930s, Hall's novel and Krzywicka preface, published also, as I mentioned, as a feature in literary news, provoked some brutal attacks from the conservative press. A case in point is visible on the screen. This is the article by Adolf Nowaczyński, a radical right-wing journalist and writer, entitled Sappho from EPUSU, which appeared in National Thought in June 1933. He used the polemics to promote anti-Semitic and homophobic views. Thus, he attacked the echo of Hall's religious views included in Krzywicka's preface and Krzywicka's own Jewish identity. In this review, we may see this toxic overlapping of ethnicity, gender, and sexuality that were very popular, very typical for the press discourse in the 1930s. But access to such cultural texts as the translation of Hall's novel or the works of Boy and Krzywicka were vital for the situation of Polish lesbians and proto-queer community, offering affirmative ways of understanding their own identities within a hostile environment. Sometimes, as in the story of anonymous Polish Jewish woman who stands for other nameless and forgotten people, it could be even essential for survival. Quote, I had a chance to read The Well of Loneliness that had been translated into Polish before I was taken into the camps. I was a young girl at the time, around 12 or 13, and one of the ways I survived in the camp was by remembering that book. I wanted to live long enough to kiss a woman. This powerful testimony has returned to Poland thanks to Joan Nessel, the co-founder of Lesbian History Archives, who retells it to new generation, and I was lucky to be included in that retelling of the story. But it is also important for another reason. When I started exploring the history of publication of The Well of Loneliness in Poland, I met several times with the opinions that this book has no reception at all, that it was not read, not reviewed. This testimony, along with several press reviews that I managed to find, actually reveals that this book was not only read, but also that it could have such important impact on the life of people then. The last text that I want to explore today, Motrakovska Sanetka, is probably the first Polish novel with sapphic themes that were not overlaid by the veneer of heteronormativity. And the opera singer, writer, and translator Motrakovska must have been a fascinating figure. She sang at Paris Opera for a few seasons, and in the years 1930-1932, she undertook a tour of Belgium, France, Great Britain, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Portugal. Beginning in the 1932, she lived tellingly in the Rive Gauche, the left bank neighborhood in Paris. In 1935, she toured all over North Africa with the composer Francis Poulenc, openly gay and fascinated by Frédéric Chopin. They performed the Huit Polonaise, 8 Polish songs, inspired by the November uprising that forced Chopin into exile. While writing these songs, Poulenc closely cooperated with Motrakovska, who prepared the text based on poems and folk songs, possibly also writing some. Poulenc dedicated the songs to Polish women émigrés living in Paris, inscribing the last song, Le Lac, the lake that you can see on the screen, to Motrakovska. And thanks to Derek and Ramsey hospitality, this song recording is actually available on the conference website. So if you are interested, you may listen to it. So in this very transnational period of her musical career, between 1926 1935, Motrakovska wrote both the play Anes and her only published novel, Anetka. Anetka can be characterized as a maze, in which characters, intertextual passages, and unexpected, frequently unconvincing turnabouts multiply. The writer blurs the boundaries between reality and the world of myths, in which wooden balls turns into globes, elves appear, and sometimes even the Egyptian queen Tao walks through a hidden garden. The notion of a great secret, along with other secrets, recurs in the novel, closely connected with the open secret identified by Sedgwick as the basic condition of lesbian gay existence in the 20th century. The main character, Anetka, resembles a Slavic water nymph called Rusałka, and from her childhood engaged in storytelling. So we have this meta-literary elements in the novel throughout the course of it. Through the course of the novel, she experiences several traumas, ranging from the early death of her parents, her mother's mental illness, sexual harassment, several suicide attempts, and finally a marriage to a man who wants to change her into incorporeal saint. But despite all these traumas, Anetka is predominantly a lesbian novel of self-discovery, including its typical motifs: awakening, journey. Although the protagonist verbalizes her discovery at the very end of the novel, it is an open secret. Lesbian tropes appear throughout the text. As a girl, Anetka admires the body of her aunt. She plays only with female dolls, is infatuated with her colleagues and schoolmates and teachers. So this is all quite stereotypical, we may say. But there are also elements in the story that are original and I think deeply moving, like the scene that you can see on the screen when Anetka is invited by her schoolmate, Regina, to a traditional Jewish wedding. She's so fascinated with the bride, Rose, that she imagines undressing her. And this scene initiates the whole undressing pattern in the novel. So this is something that is several times repeated. Quote, Anetka is bewitched, and suddenly Anetka feels a great urge to see how does Zuzia unclothe herself. In her mind, she removes the veil, combs golden hair. Do they smell of bitter almonds like Regina's hair? Unbuttons a heavy satin dress and sees Zuzia in her underwear. The lesbian tropes frequently appear also as intertextual passages. It seems that Motrakovska readings of homoerotic texts was quite extensive, ranging from Colette and Hall to Mann and Proust. For instance, the fascination with her schoolmate Tea Conescu, a Romanian aristocrat, seems initially the echo of Colette's Claudine, as you can see on the screen. It was queer. Indeed, it was queer that no one noticed Anetka's feelings. It was said, indeed, that she and Tea were less inseparables, but that was all. Nonetheless, from the very moment Anetka fell in love with Tea, all younger girls developed a crush on her. Simply the plague struck the boarding school. The full name of Tea, Aristea, signals her role in Anetka's life. It means the excellence, but it was also a term used in epic Greek poetry, depicting the hero triumphs in the battle. So Anetka's infatuation with Tea turns into a lifelong tragic love. Although Anetka enters into relationship also with men, she compares them all unfavorably with Tea and longs for their presence. Motrakovska's novel is sensual and corporeal. In contrast with the nightmare of sexual abuse, lesbian sexuality is depicted as neither perverse, nor does it carry the stigma of inversion. Importantly, it is inscribed into mythical stories in which Tea and Anetka are represented by lunar and solar imagery, or become the incarnation of an Egyptian queen and Greek priestess. So when Anetka asks Tea to undress, and wear only an old Egyptian necklace of dead turquoise stones and silver, she suddenly realizes that it used to be a gift from Tea, but from the distant past, when she was, quote, an Egyptian queen named Tea who had mysterious garden surrounded by tall wall and a broad bed covered with green silk tapestry. Importantly, by presenting this Egyptian-Greek union, Motrakovska most probably alludes to the fate of Sappho's Greek poetry, most of which was destroyed by the Christian hierarchs in the Middle Ages, but survived miraculously on Egyptian papyrus scrolls. The novel ends typically for the early lesbian novels, so with Anetka's suicide. And only just before this dramatic closure, the protagonist for the first time considers an alternative to marriage to a man and rebels against the seeming impossibility of living together with Tea. This is probably one of the first non-Polish texts in which the idea of marriage equality appeared, as you can see on the screen in the question, why cannot you marry the beloved if this person is of the same sex? And there is also this vision of creating this alternative queer family with adopted children from the orphanage. It was very soon picked by the reviewers, of course, not favorably. As you can see in the review published in January 1934 in Literary News, the critic Piwiński mocked the alternative vision of life that was conjured at the end of the novel. Quote, "Methinks Sanetka wants too much. Mere lesbian love is not enough for her. She wants for this love some kind of blessing, an official marriage ceremony. It is unknown whether civil or church one." So as we could see as early as in the 1930s, although in this very mocking, pejorative, diminishing way, the questions of lesbian love and also same-sex union appeared in Polish press. In Anetka, lesbian love transgresses the national community. First in Anetka's crush on Jewish bride Russia, and then in her love for Romanian Tea. Novel presents lesbian love as a life-changing emotion set within the cultural mosaic and illuminates the world of multi-ethnic Polands lost in the Second World War. It may also allude to the transnational relationships of expatriates living, as Motrakovska herself in 1931, on the left bank of Paris. Similarly to Virginia Woolf's Orlando, the shifting temporal perspectives and mythical elements could be, of course, seen as a smokescreen, protecting the author from the charges of censorship and immorality. So, to finish my presentation, how this sapphic and partly transgender proto-queer myths are remembered, marginalized, or forgotten within Polish queer studies and on broader canvas of Polish cultural memory. Żeleński's Gabriela Romance has been widely discussed, creating a founding sapphic myth in Polish literature. This essay has been reprinted many times in new editions of Polish work, and as you could see in the Anthology of Polish Queer Literature this very year. The translation of Hall's novel, banned after the obscenity trial in the UK, has been marginalized and lasted within Polish cultural memory mostly through Krzywicka's preface. In the 2000, Krzywicka's essay articles have been rediscovered by gender and queer scholars, and around the year 2000, after 67 years, the extract of Źródło and Krzywicka preface were published in the literary feminist lesbian magazine, Fury First. The text also appeared in the recent anthology. Hall's The Well of Loneliness has attracted little attention, though the novel offered a proto-queen heroine along with sapphic and transgender themes to Polish interwar readers. The third text, Motrakovska Sanetka, was probably the first Polish novel with openly sapphic themes, inscribing sexuality in this mythical realm, creating inspiring sapphic myths. Tellingly, Anetka has faded into complete oblivion, and the only known copy is held in the National Library in Warsaw. If Anetka is reissued, the novel could fill in the void within the Polish lesbian queer culture and return to our collective memory as a part of modernist legacy, both Polish and transnational, sapphic and queer, heteronormative and non-heteronormative. And if you are interested in reading more about Polish lesbian modernism or about queer motifs in Polish contemporary literature, I recommend a publication that I base my paper upon. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Paulina, and thanks again to all three presenters for such varied and rich presentations.
Florian Masnog is a professor of comparative literature and Italian studies at University College London. His research interests focus on modern and contemporary literature in Italian, English, and German, speculative fiction, posthumanism, narratives of catastrophe and global existential risk. Today, he'll be talking about parenthood, climate justice, and the ethics of care, with notes towards queer analysis. And you'll notice that Carmen isn't listed today. Unfortunately, Carmen wasn't able to come, and so you're going to have to contend with me instead. We're going to have some discussion, but Florian's going to start with just a presentation to give us some framework for the conversation. I'll be chairing the session. I apologize, I haven't been able to attend as much as I'd like over the past few days, but I will welcome comments throughout, and so I'll try to help with noticing hands throughout. So thanks. The floor is yours, Florian.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Alison, for the introduction. Thank you for stepping in. And I'm very sorry, and I'm also sort of meant to pass on apologies from Carmen, who unfortunately isn't well and can't be here. But obviously, like myself, she's very grateful to Derek and Ramsey and to you all for the interest in our work. So, Alison, I'm really grateful that you are willing to kind of sort of discuss this. So I'll rush through what I have in terms of a kind of sort of initial introductory reflection. I'll see if I can sort of summarize this in sort of 5-6 minutes or so, and then we'll discuss it a bit, and then we'd like to open it up. It's a big topic, and the spirit of our suggestion, of our proposal to Derek and Ramsey was very much to kind of sort of open these questions rather than kind of provide a definitive answer, which would be ridiculous. So as Alison has very kindly mentioned, I work on world literature, so I'm very interested in both the idea of sort of cosmopolitan belonging, sort of transnationalism, but also the critique of totalizing perspectives associated with the global. I'm very interested in inequalities and in threats to meaningful cultural diversity. And my own research, as again Alison has already mentioned, is at the intersection of world literature and sort of narratives of global catastrophe. So I'm interested in risk, I'm interested in speculation, I'm interested in the genres which focus on speculation, which is not the same thing as anticipation, at least that's not how I understand it. So opening up possibilities. So I'm interested in science fiction, I'm interested in cli-fi, I'm interested in utopia, dystopia. Quite more recently, I focused on climate change, on environmental degradation, and the temporal directionalities of planetary entanglement, and on how writers, I work primarily on the novel. I'm not really very good with film. Narrative prose fiction uses fictional worlds, imaginary worlds, as diachronic conceptual maps. So how we kind of sort of juxtapose these different ideas of sort of temporality, agency, responsibility. The idea of the planetary is, of course, a reference to some of these thinkers. Here, for those of you who are familiar with the field, this is very obvious stuff. Ursula Heise, Gayatri Spivak, who coined the term planetarity in that book, which is a complete book, although now everybody uses planetarity. So we take great pride in owning that term. And also, of course, Donna Haraway, who I forgot to mention. This is also a definition which I like from Debjani Ganguly, a book of 2016, where this is, again, a study of media, actually, and world literature, not specifically on climate change, but it works very well as a way of framing my interest. So she says she's interested in fictional worlds, not as literary simulacra of our current geopolitical world order, nor as a sort of single compressed space-time, but as a collage, something that contains many worlds that travel with, haunt, layer, and disrupt other worlds, even as it is informed by our present time. So this is kind of what I've tried to do in this project with Carmen in relation to threats that relate to human overpopulation as a global environmental risk factor, and to how this changes and transforms ideas and narratives of parenthood and parental responsibility. So, sorry, I'm not going to talk about this, I don't think. I will say something, just to sort of, something that I've worked on myself prior to the dialogue with Carmen is the period from a very interesting period in the 1970s, when the 1968 is, for those of you interested in this, is when this book is published, a very controversial book at the time, the population bomb, and there is this sort of idea of that human overpopulation will cause a huge threat to a sort of Malthusian nightmare in the very near future. So in the Italian context, you have the Club of Rome, you have Aurelio Peccei, who's a sort of an industrialist and somebody who is both a sponsor and a very sort of eager student of these questions. And over just a few years, you have in Italy a sort of sudden explosion of interest in this from the translation of sort of these well-known Anglophone dystopian fictions about overpopulation to very peculiar and sort of fascinating and distinctly Italian thinkers like Roberto Vacca, who's a social theorist, systems analyst, and a science fiction writer, or Super Studio, who's a collective of architects and writers. So without wanting to simplify too much, what we see when we look at the 70s is there seems to be a connection between how these new narratives of parental responsibility and planetary responsibility are more widely shared, and how family, ideas of the family and ideas of parenthood change. Here you have these are very famous graphs. Italy becomes over the course of just a few years sort of has a dip in fertility rates, and of course it's gone on to become one of the countries with the lowest natality rate certainly in Europe, but perhaps also at the moment globally. So all these things happen together. It's a very interesting period, and I hope to continue my work on it. But what I wanted to do with Carmen is to take some of these questions into the very present and to look at the current situation, at reproductive futurism, problematic term, as a discursive nexus point relating to debates about rights, responsibility, technologies, gender identity, species identity, and also to think about generation not only as an act of procreation, but also as a shared temporality, right? So Carmen is a professor at the University of Pisa. She's also an artist and a constructivist psychotherapist. And she's one of the co-founders and the current director of an Italian Center for Queer Studies. So apologies in advance. A lot of the thinking around queer theory is actually come from Carmen. It's not my own area of expertise. Here I just listed our shared assumptions, what we agreed about, as it were. So we agreed that human reproduction is not an inherent good, that a carefully reasoned case for the permissibility and desirability of procreation can and must be made. We don't like coercive policies and mechanisms of population control, so we don't feel that kind of sort of antinatalism imposed is acceptable in the context of persistent and growing inequalities. We are very interested in the kind of way in which decolonial scholarship allows us to understand the cultural complexity of these growing inequalities. We don't like the fact that, sorry, I'm speaking in slightly Mickey Mousey terms, but you'll forgive me. We don't like the fact that a lot of these discussions are primarily paying attention to, or sort of thinking about needs and rights in relation to the well-resourced individualized user primarily in the global north. And we hope to rethink parental responsibility not only in the context of assisted reproductive technology as an egalitarian, transcultural, and post-anthropocentric practice of care, right? So this is a big challenge. We didn't agree on quite a few other things, which will be evident to you when you read the thing, which is written like a dialogue. So Carmen is much more radical in her understanding of post-human ethics than I am. We are not interested, and I'm grateful that this has come up in some of the other discussions, so I don't have to sort of really go into this. But we're not interested primarily for the purposes of this discussion in queer as an identitarian category. We're interested in queering as a practice of, these are some of Carmen's references, which we discussed, sort of decentering shared assumptions, sort of cultural practices in order to enable strategies of resistance, not necessarily exclusively in the context of gender and sexuality. This is what came out of it. As I said, the piece, I'm happy to share the piece. It's a dialogue. It came out in January in a special issue of the Italian journal Phenomenology and Mind. The special issue also has a really good piece by Charlotte Ross, who I think is in the audience somewhere. Hi, Charlotte. Thank you for writing for our special issue. And contributions by philosophers, legal scholars, and life scientists. So it was a very mixed sort of trans-disciplinary conversation, very difficult to control. What we found, what Carmen and I found, what we tried to respond to is that there is a sort of growing concern again now, like in the 70s, with over a population, and we're sort of trying to rethink what it means to be, what parental responsibility means. So both in the sense of responsibility for children and the responsible decision to bring children into the world. These are right, we have philosopher Tim Mulligan, who I found out on Wednesdays at St. Andrews, actually. I love this book, Ethics for a Broken World. Alison and I discussed it briefly when we spoke. But here are also some other examples, more or less successful examples, to kind of sort of prompt a more open and shared debate around these issues. And there's a lot of material in contemporary fiction. I could go on and on about this, because this is really the only bit that I feel I understand properly. But narratives of sort of toxic children, narratives of children who come from the future to haunt the present, like in Liz Jensen's The Uninvited, narratives of sort of children who sacrifice themselves for parents who sacrifice themselves in order to give birth. So this theme is everywhere in speculative fiction at the moment. And what we felt, what Carmen and I were interested in, was how the idea of sort of uncertainty, the shift from a holocenic to an anthropocenic environment where planetary futures are much more unpredictable, risk scenarios are much more variable and greater. All this makes it very difficult, or we felt it made it very difficult for us to really work with definitions like this famous definition of parental responsibility by the philosopher Nora O'Neill, who talks about the decision to procreate and to think about the level which the world in which you bring the child will at least minimally guarantee a good life for the future child. So we found that these kinds of sort of reflections were getting more and more complicated. I'm personally very interested in how narratives, queer in that sort of broad sense, narratives of parenthood and of having parents as well, brings new perspectives to these questions, not in the sense of sort of clear binding definitions, but more in the sense of these sort of affective tangles, which Rachel Bowlby, my colleague at UCL, describes in this book, A Child of One's Own, where she says, we experience parenthood sometimes as an imposition, sometimes as something much wished for, surprisingly found as joy. Sometimes all of these things happen to the same person at different times or with different children. Delight, boredom, agony. So I'm very interested in the way sort of opening up these narratives to a much wider range of affect in order to sort of rethink both our relation with our children and our relation as parents of children with our planet. And I think that's where I would hand over, if I may, to you, Alison, because I know that you're actually very interested in this aspect of sort of, affect and parenthood yourself. I'll stop sharing.
Great, thanks. That was great. And so before we talk about affect and parenting, we had discussed a few things first, because I would love to talk about hope and future, but as a philosopher, I want to get our terms straight. And so I'd love to go back to first how you and we can think about what parenthood is and a queering account of parenthood, and going back to what Carmen said, which is, she said, and I think you also called it into question, the idea that the stories we tell about reproduction will not evolve. And so I was thinking about how our concepts of parenthood has always been relational, mother to father, relational, and how, in my mind, what counts, how we're understanding reproduction and how we're understanding parenthood is indeed changing tremendously, and has already quite a bit, and is still in that evolution of changing. And so I wanted to start off with that before we could think about what responsibilities we have, what restrictions we want to give on it, and what the potential outcomes would be.
That's a really interesting point. I think I'm much more comfortable with your perspective on this than the way in which Carmen describes this in the dialogue. I think Carmen is what she tried to convey in the dialogue, and also when we had the conference in Rome, which inspired the dialogue, was sort of, I think, a profound pessimism about sort of how parenthood, or sort of certainly in Western societies, was very profoundly tied up with ideas of self-fashioning, and also lineage, passing on status, wealth, narcissistic investment. So she think, I agree with all this, and I think she's right to say it's very, this is where we have to kind of sort of start thinking differently, and but she seemed to be quite pessimistic about the sort of ability to achieve this. Whereas I feel when you look at the literary fiction, of course, there's a question which is in itself hugely interesting, as to sort of how many people read these books and who reads them, and whether they bring about behavioral change, really. But the literary fiction suggests that these models are changing much more quickly.
Yes, and it seems, so we can look at literature and, I'd say, film and TV shows, and what sort of examples were being given. When I first started teaching about sex and love, I feel and really as a young person, I felt like there weren't many examples out in the world of gay couples that I could see on TV. And now we're seeing far more examples of non-monogamous and polyamory couples and queer couples just out in media. And I will just say, the standard book that parents are giving their children these days on what makes a baby it shows far more different pictures of what makes a baby, what makes a parent. And so, well, this isn't fiction, it still is impacting how young people are thinking about who counts as a parent and what counts as being part of the reproduction.
Yeah, Charlotte is sharing in the chat that she read the book with a 5-year-old, but I was actually also thinking Charlotte wrote about this in her contribution to the special issue, so it I think that's right. I think again, the conference is very, very brings together a lot of different perspectives from different cultures and regions, and I think it's very, for me, it's a huge challenge to kind of sort of generalize across cultures. Certainly, a lot of the literature that is written, the novels that are written around this are written in English, for example. So there's a bit of a gap between what I can find and the kinds of sort of stories and the kinds of characters that I can find when I read novels, in English, and when I read novels in other languages, what sometimes makes me cringe a bit more, without again wanting to have a sort of late colonial gaze on any of this.
Absolutely. So in that sense, you are fully convinced that it is evolving, the notion of parenthood? And then do you think reproduction is following along with that?
I'm not a social scientist, and I feel one of the big challenges for any work in any political work in literary studies is precisely what I tried to sort of say earlier. There are very few studies that really systematically explore how fiction or sort of texts which are speculative in the sense that I've described affect communities or sort of affect individuals and bring about behavioral change. That's also true for climate action. There's just sort of 2 or 3 big studies, and they look at very big films like Avatar or sort of the Day After Tomorrow, and so I'm always a little bit mindful of that. But it seems to me that this is changing, and it seems to me that this is also affecting reproductive behavior, as you say. Yes, I mean not in the same ways across communities and across countries, obviously, but yes. Do you agree?
So then, if we, I do. I do think it's changing, but one big question we have in terms of thinking about not just so it's not just reproductive, so what maybe is morally appropriate or not with reproduction, but the responsibilities we have. And so one of the things that Carmen's position called into question is, and I've had a hard time squaring in my own head, is the idea that if we don't have autonomy over our own bodies, as say a woman who's concerned about the future because of future people, and so maybe I wouldn't be allowed to have children, how do we square that with the autonomy that over our bodies that we've fought so hard to have in terms of being permitted to have abortions? So I've been really struggling with trying to understand how to deal with those two issues.
Yeah, I think that's one of the points which were very deep. One of the reasons why we felt more comfortable with the idea of a dialogue than with the idea of a sort of co-authored journal article was because we wanted to in a sense flag different ways of thinking about this. And I mean, it's relatively easy to be opposed to coercive regimes of birth control, and it's easy to to be adverse to eugenics. I mean, probably very few people would write an article and say that they support any form of that. But it becomes, I mean, when you zoom in closer, I think there are degrees of how much you would, how greatly you would sort of value the individual freedom of reproductive choice, not necessarily in terms of reproductive rights, which I would sort of feel is a problematic term in this context, but choice. And I don't think we've come up, to be honest, with this piece, we haven't come up with a sort of kind of answer that we feel is entirely satisfactory. So it's work in progress at that level, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think in general, if you're thinking about having children or you have children and you look at what's happening around the globe and what the future might look like, then there's a sense in which you call into question actions of bringing children into the world. No?
Yeah. Yes, I think that's right. I mean, what I find really, where I really would like to sort of think further about these issues is in relation to hope, as we discussed in preparation for this, and sort of whether we need any degree of hope in order to have a sense of planetary responsibility, and whether this sense of hope is, I'm not talking about optimism. I think, hope doesn't necessarily mean that you have any reason to assume that things will get better. But whether that idea of sort of hope in the sense of sort of still thinking about how your actions will affect future beings and of any kind and any species, and acting responsibly because of this. I mean, I wonder whether that notion of hope is at least minimally anthropocentric. I mean, for me, I guess it is, in the sense that I feel that there's, if we sort of, that a radically anti-natalist position, David Beneta is the philosopher who's kind of sort of been consistently arguing that a world without humans, I'm simplifying again because I'm not a philosopher, sorry Alison, but a world without humans doesn't have an ethical problem, because I'm not, I'd like to think of an answer to this which is more nuanced. And I think the answer that I'm giving myself, not necessarily in a kind of sort of systematic philosophical way, but also in existential ways, that we need some kind of sort of, it doesn't have to be our own biological children, but it has to be a sort of interest in the future, that in order to kind of sort of take an interest in the planet. And I think that interest in the future very often for most of us is connected to our sense of being human. So, and I know Carmen disagrees with this. I happen to know, so it's unfair that she's not here and she can't disagree with me, but I know Carmen is not comfortable with this idea. She's very interested in hope, but she thinks she doesn't believe that the hope is anthropocentric, to put it in a kind of sort of nutshell.
And you and I discussed, I think there is a worry that with too much hope, that means it might be preventative of action to create the sort of future that is necessary for human life to flourish. And if one has too much hope, they might not act today to make for a good future for children. And it's unclear if you don't have any hope, then maybe that also might prevent action to make for a better future. I think officially we started a few minutes late. And so I was going to stop at 5 past, but I wondered if maybe we would allow for the last 3 minutes to see if anyone else had any questions or comments that they wanted to share in the discussion before we
That would be great. I can't see any hands up.
No, I don't see any hands.
We can just keep chatting then.
If anyone does want to chime in, they're welcome to do so. And then I figured we'd just end at 5 past so that there would be enough time for a proper break. So there
is a question.
I will just want to ask, go ahead. It's Dr. Bakji. Yeah.
Should I ask the question? Yeah. So yes. So it's a very interesting conversation that you are having. Thank you for that. I am asking this question from the context of India, because at this moment there is a huge debate going on here about the legalization of same-sex marriage, and the government, the current government, is opposed to that. Now, the LGBT movement in India is fiercely divided into two groups, where one says that, we do not want same-sex marriage to be the next agenda. We want policy making, we want homes, we want employment. Same-sex marriage is not something which you're looking for. Now, there is another group which says that, same-sex marriage is important because, that ensures a right to equality. Now, there is a kind of a bifurcation across the community where, we can feel it, like when we are working with people and talking to people all the time, that some people are extremely critical of this idea of queer marriage, because they feel that, the moment you get married, it appears as if you are trying to get into the heteronormative mold, and thereby you are being, you can say you are betraying your queer self. So, heteronormative, or for that matter, as Lisa Duggan says, homonormativity, for instance. So the idea of parenthood, children, all these are like a far cry to them, and the very idea of marriage appears very problematic to them. It appears as if we are being treacherous to our queer identity or queer politics, which has always challenged the idea of the family, the idea of being together, the idea of parenthood, everything. So, for instance, like a country in India where family, marriage, everything is like so, I can say, it's like it bears a lot of social currency. People love that. People want to have a family. People want to marry. But, there is a huge section of the queer community which is very, very opposed to this idea. That, well, we do not want to get into that mold again. Forget about children. We don't even want to get married. So would you like to comment on that? Like, can you respond across cultures?
Alison, would you like to answer this, or shall I?
Yeah, I mean, I can say a few things. One is, there has been, not just in India, but at least a philosopher in the States has written extensively on this issue against marriage for these exact reasons. And I think there's movements in the polyamory community against marriage also for these exact reasons. And it calls into question thinking of parenthood in a motherhood, fatherhood sort of manner, and not acknowledging the other types of parents that there might be, and that it doesn't have to just be two parents. And so I greatly appreciate the move against marriage, but I think there's other political issues about, without marriage, then there's a lot of anti-allowing people to have children. It also, without marriage, often doesn't allow multiple people to claim parenthood of an individual child in a legal and health sort of way. And so I think it's very difficult, and I don't think it is, I do think there's cultural issues here, but I don't think it is unique to Indian culture that this is an issue. I think this is an issue all over the world and across many different cultures. It's a problem about thinking about parenthood in a very narrow manner.
Thank you,
Lauren,
Alison.
Do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, thank you, Alison.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think. I mean, I think I agree with both of you in the sense that you've described something which I very much recognize and which I think is a question that I feel, you know, when we had this opportunity to discuss also with bioscientists and people who as medical practitioners work with reproductive technologies, there was a sense that levels of interest in these bigger questions were very different across. I mean, obviously, you know, there are exceptions, but sort of if you think of the sort of degree of attention to these issues among cultural literary scholars, philosophers, legal scholars, and you think to the degree of interest among some of the people who we invited who were superb, you know, leading scholars in their fields, you know, the idea that there is a sort of the fact that you would want, there's a wish to be a parent is a starting point for then a sort of exploration of scientific possibilities, and not the wish to be a parent is not something which is sort of to be understood in a cultural context as something which is potentially, you know, interestingly connected to other forms of sort of inequality or sort of cultural legacies which we consider problematic. That just doesn't seem to feature. So I think it's really important to have the conversation as broadly as we can.
That seems right. On that note, I think we're plenty out of time. So I want to make sure that everyone has a moment to stretch their legs and get some coffee or tea if they need to. So we'll end the session, and then I think we're officially starting back up in another 10 minutes or so. Is that right?
Thank you all.
So I'm just going to start with this clip.
Risolvo tutto io, però l'importante è che fin quando siamo qua dobbiamo comportarci proprio come delle umane. Comunque tu, Yara, stai appresso a Salvatore e mi raccomando, fate in fretta perché prima ce ne andiamo da questa terra fedente e meglio è.
Sì, Salvatore mi ha detto che mi aiuta, mi aiuterà. Io mi fido di lui.
Ti fidi di un umano? Fai male, perché gli umani fanno grandi danni anche quando vogliono fare del bene.
So episode after episode, the Sirene, or Mermaids, of Ivan Cotroneo's 2017 television series of the same name, asks human characters and spectators to look differently at our everyday actions. As we can see by this brief scene, Cotroneo's matriarchal mermaids, much like the teenagers of his recent La Compagnia del Cigno, which I'll also examine, embody and perform a difference that exists outside of expectation, asking the normative characters and televisual spectators to reflect on the very logic behind what we consider normal. And in this way, they're a locus of queer potential in contemporary Italian television. By being, as Halberstam would have it, wild things, it's these characters, namely the mermaids and troubled teens, and not the lesbian, gay, and transgender characters, that shake up, dismantle, and murder the epistemology and ontology behind Western subjects' lived experience and mediatic representation, precisely because of the struggle and potential within their wildness, and that's what I'm going to explore in today's paper. Ivan Cotroneo has been one of the most prolific creators of LGBT television content in Italy, and I'm using the acronym LGBT, and sometimes you'll hear me say LGT, right, depending on what kind of representation I'm talking about. His mediatic reach, His mediatic reach spans from film to television to digital productions, and his professional hats are just as varied as producer, screenwriter, showrunner, and creator. In fact, I think it would be safe to call Cotroneo the Italian Ryan Murphy. Ryan Murphy, the creator of Glee and many other queer American shows, with all of the singing and dancing teenagers included. Through consistent representation, Cotroneo has sought to create empathy and understanding for LGBT lives. In the Italian, I already said that. Because of this, Cotroneo's work has been nominated for Diversity Media Awards 5 times in the last 4 years, winning for both È arrivata la felicità and Io a lei in 2016, and his 2016 film Un bacio, One Kiss, was particularly praised for its anti-bullying, anti-homophobia messaging. And here's just some of the press about that, that movie. So you have like against homophobia, against bullying, over and over again. What I'll show you briefly today, however, is that the lesbian, gay, and transgender characters in Cotroneo's shows reflect back on us the same norms that the wild characters in the programs are not confined by. The homonormativity of these LGT characters seems aspirational, whereas when the wild characters are constricted into conformity, it ends up highlighting the detrimental effects of the hetero-adult human normativity that determines our everyday lives. Thus, the queerness of these programs can be found within the wildness of the non-LGBT identifying characters. Wildness, as Jack Halberstam notes in his recent work, Wild Things, the Disorder of Desire, names simultaneously a chaotic force of nature, the outside of categorization, unrestrained forms of embodiment, the refusal to submit to social regulation, loss of control, the unpredictable. Sirene is Cotroneo's 2017 Rai Uno series about a family of mermaids who go on dry land to search for Ares, the one remaining Mediterranean Triton who's fled the ocean realm and thwarted their procreation plans. Upon their initial entrance into human society, viewers are immediately confronted with the difference between their corporeality, their familial structures, customs, and those of the Neapolitan people they encounter when they come to shore. They struggle to understand and adapt to the human way of living, whether it be wearing the proper clothing for the proper environment, wearing shoes in general, using their human voices, and tolerating the smells and ignorance of human men. We live this difference with them, not from the perspective of the humans, but from theirs. So I'm gonna skip because I got really excited about all these clips, but I don't think we have time for all of them. So I'm gonna skip to halfway through.
Infatti puzzano di umano. Il mio bello odore di pesce quasi non lo sento più. Non sono vestiti all'altezza, questo lo capisco pure io. Se abbiamo una brancata di disgraziate, dobbiamo fare qualcosa. Ci penso io. Grazie signore, arrivederci. Mi dispiace non ho spiccioli. Provate il negozio più avanti. Sa che lei è un uomo bellissimo, bellissimo, bellissimo. Prego, accomodatevi. Tutto quello che volete. Vi faccio strada? Venite, venite. Maschi e pure umani. Si è mai vista una razza più inferiore?
When the sales associate initially dismisses them, making assumptions about them based on their looks, Marika doesn't play into that whole human social dynamic, and instead woos him unfazed, into letting them in and giving them everything they want, ultimately dismantling the social cultural hierarchies behind these attitudes and actions. But it isn't all culture clashing. In an effort to preserve their freedom, they take great lengths to hide their true identities, remain closeted. Their self-preservation depends on this radical closeting that in anthropological and cultural studies terms we might call resistance within the frameworks of cultural dominance. As Richard Rogers explains, resistance involves more covert opposition, the adoption of aspects of the imposed culture in such a way as to maintain a native culture and/or resist cultural domination, often without the awareness of the colonizing culture. They resist cultural domination by passing as human, but not adopting a self-understanding based on a dichotomic othering of difference that would not only position them as having less power, but as beings that need to be dominated and controlled. This kind of passing preserves and celebrates their difference. Excuse the ambulance is going by. This kind of passing preserves and celebrates their difference by not allowing it to succumb to an idea of difference that operates within societal norms of normal and normative, which are heavily imbued with colonialist value judgments. This is much different from the passing performed by transgender character Olga in La Compagnia del Cigno, which we'll see later on, a passing that, in opposition to the radical closet, is created by a desire to exist on the normative side of normal, value judgments and all, that these mermaids resist. When we look at the wildness of the mermaids in relation to the human characters and human frameworks of understanding, what comes out is in fact a strong link to queerness and LGBTQIA+ experience, specifically when it comes to sex. Ultimately, main protagonist Yara, and I'm gonna give you a spoiler alert, so if you are just riveted by this, please don't listen for the next few minutes. Yara decides that she's not interested in continuing the species with Ares after all, because she's fallen in love with human Salvatore. But when they both end up on the same page about their feelings emotionally and can be together, they can't. They can't because she's a mermaid. And in processing her coming out to him, Salvatore comes to realize that to consummate his love for this otherworldly creature would be, for all intents and purposes, bestiality. Links between bestiality and sodomy are longstanding. Both crimes against nature have been historically grouped together in anti-sodomy laws. While these two acts have since been unlinked, Halberstam once again reminds us, quote, within various contemporary accounts of intimacies between humans and animals, this connection reappears like a shadow formation, unquote. This queer link is reinforced by Salvatore's brothers when he reveals to them that he and Yara cannot be together.
Se ci pensavo prima non sarebbe cambiato niente, tanto io e Yara non potevate stare insieme, madonna che cantilene, che gualda, un rollo proprio. Ma che lo dici a fare allora se non puoi spiegare le ragioni di questo mistero? Sposata o non è sposata? Ha una malattia rara, è un travestito. Magari un transgender, è in transizione, è già transitato. Vabbè, ma comunque a noi invece non può, siamo una famiglia aperta, apertissima. Siamo gente moderna. Hai bisogno di una distrazione, di un diversivo, chiamalo come da parte.
So, and I'm sorry for the video quality. I don't have much space on my computer. Yara and Salvatore do, however, end up being together. And their queer act of bestiality is precisely what turns Yara into a full-fledged human. She gives up the matriarchal aquatic world where women's superiority is taken as a matter of fact and marriage doesn't exist, for a chance to pursue terrestrial human love and existence. Precisely 9 months after they queerly consummate their relationship, they are, it would seem, a happy, normal couple. The last scene reinforces this notion of sameness, but leaves a queer window open at the very end. A queerness that lets us all reflect differently on what sameness actually is. And again, I'm going to start this about halfway through.
Avremo una bellissima vita. Semplice, ma poco noiosa come le vite di tutti. Non vedo.
Oops, not so normal. Cotroneo himself has stated in interviews that it's useful to talk about difference using a framework that relies on the point of view of an outsider. But what he's actually doing here is pointing out the outsider in all of us. Yara is the same. She's human. She has a family. She's the same, but she isn't the same. The insider-outsider dichotomy that exists when the wild and the savage is pinned against the human, the civilized, the colonizer, no longer applies. One need only reflect on what closets we use to store our wildness. What the 7 teenage musician protagonists of La Compagnia del Cigno who attend the Giuseppe Verdi Music Conservatory in Milan have in common with the mermaids is this same wildness, a wildness that, to quote Halberstam again, constantly spins away from the biopolitical attempts to manage life and bodies and desires. Indeed, as teenagers, their bodies and their desires are constantly at odds with the systems and expectations of the adults that claim to tame them for their own good. And it's largely conflicts or troubles that arise because of their relationships to these adults or to social expectations more broadly that these 7 teenage protagonists are viewed as disruptive or problematic. Main protagonist Matteo has just moved to Milan to move in with his uncle after witnessing his mother's death. Robbo's parents are separating. Rosario's living with foster parents because his mother is a recovering addict. Barbara's constantly being pushed to overachieve by her demanding perfectionist mother. Domenico's working class father expects his son to join him in class war. Sophia struggles with constant ridicule from others about her weight. And Sara, proudly considered the most asshole of the bunch, is in constant battle against those who think that because of her lack of sight, she's incapable of doing the activities her peers are engaged in. Much like the mermaids, the company of swans, the Compagnia del Cigno, when forced to live within the confines of human society, finds freedom in the closet, the only safe space where free expression and embodied actions and reactions are possible. We see this in Robbo as he brings his little sister into the wilds of the safe and imaginary world beneath his bedsheets, which we see in the top right picture. far away from the troubles of his parents, and we experience it even more explicitly in the character of Rosario. Let's see, he brings his friends into the closet with him. Hold on. Here we go.
Ciao. Serve anche a me oggi. Studio o famiglia? Famiglia, ma preferirei non parlarne. A te non dispiace, Marco? Scherzo, Matteo, dai.
It's really quite a long screaming scene. This is a moment of both catharsis and revolt. It contains the pleasure of a queer release. As scholar Andrew Scahill remarks, quote, "The pleasure of the revolting child is decidedly queer in its object and its aims, and it provides an inroad to examine the child as an avatar rather than an antithesis of anti-heteronormative social praxis. When not closeted, this wildness exhibits as unapologetic revolt." And I'll just show you a little bit of this. This is my favorite clip, and I put it on the Epistemicides website so you can go watch the full thing.
Scusami. No! Oddio, ma che ho fatto? Scusami, non ho capito. Potresti finire il gelato fuori, oppure mi dici cosa stai cercando e ti aiuto io? Guarda, in realtà vado un po' di fretta, non so esattamente cosa voglio. Sto cercando qualcosa che mi ispiri, capisci? Però per capire se una cosa mi ispira la devo toccare, quindi col no. No, oddio, ma che faccio? Ma no, scusami, io appunto cosa fai? Ma no, e che cazzo però, no, dai, per favore, ti aiuto, ti ho detto che ti aiuto, dai, occhio! Occhio un cazzo che sono cieca però, un po' di rispetto.
He continues to just destroy the store. It's really quite satisfying. As Scahill notes again, quote, "Perhaps the most disruptive quality of revolting children is that they have no need or desire to become replicas of their adult counterparts. Theirs is a queerness wrapped in wildness, a wildness that feels both empowered by its difference and burdened by the expectations imposed and the limited social frameworks created by those with power. At times, this excess of feeling may manifest in violence, either towards others or towards the self, like when Matteo strikes his orchestra teacher Marioni on the head with his violin. While the act of acting out in itself is not in response to any kind of normative expectation, but rather violence as redirected emotional release in reaction to traumatic loss, it points to the limitations of propriety, the need to put these feelings somewhere but having nowhere safe to do so. Theirs are acts of violence that reject suppression of feeling or notion of legitimized emotional spaces. As Sarah Ahmed reminds us, emotionality as a claim about a subject or a collective is clearly dependent on relations of power, which endow others with meaning and value. In fact, Ahmed, as well as Richard Dyer and recently Michael Lovelock, have all discussed the othering and queerness that surrounds discourses of emotion, and particularly excess emotion. And I'm going to start to sum up here. Halberstam tells us that queerness without wildness is just white homosexual desire out of the closet and in sync with a new normal. And this is precisely where we find the gay and trans characters within this narrative. The gay and trans characters in these shows are not there to demand their rights. They're not there to convince you that they matter. They are indeed there to blend, there to pass, rejecting the excess and alterity that we see in the powerful queer wildness of the other characters. Matteo's gay uncle Daniele, in fact, can hardly even say that he's gay. He becomes visibly uneasy when his nephew calls him feminine and dumps his boyfriend when his excessive flamboyance and promiscuity prove too much. When Daniele himself attempts to see two men at the same time, he ends up losing the one he truly cares for. It's only with the help of trans-normative neighbor Olga that he can finally have the monogamous relationship he wanted all along, right? Because she's a little more old school. She helps him not disrupt, she helps him belong. Cotroneo has been praised for his depictions of diversity. And indeed, as we've seen, these shows contain many gay, lesbian, and transgender characters. The queerness here and the real destructive force lies not, however, within them. It lives within everyone, or rather, everyone else. There's a queer potential to reject the inscribed roles that seem to stifle the wild within, a freeing wild. In Cotroneo's body of work, the epistemicide is being performed on the queer, as it's used to disrupt the normative and done so through the notion of the wild. The queerness challenges normativity from the inside out. In this way, the wildness, the queerness becomes a way of calling into question the way we understand the norm without shaking up so much its infrastructure. It's a call for tolerance through self-reflection, through an identification with the other that is revealed to be us. We were all mermaids. We were all rebel children before we became what we are, and they are still inside of us. So what is the potential of this queer wildness? What liberties and pathways towards radicality might these characters contain? And if this kind of wildness is not rooted in identity, but rather in the desire and act of unmaking, we may likewise relinquish our stronghold on the importance of the what then and notions of progress and goals. Esquihel notes of rebel children, they have found the discredited tradition that seeks to assimilate them and called it by its name, lost boys and girls who have no interest in being found. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone, to this, our final session of the conference. We're calling it the closing but open-ended interlude because as we kind of hope for it, the debates which have been initiated over the last couple of days are not drawing to conclusion. We've been absolutely stunned by the way in which presenters and participants have ranged over issues about queer writing, rewriting, resignifications, creative practice, language, activism, temporality, space, what it means to be human, how we connect across disciplines, across media, the geopolitical and historical diversities which we've explored, the inheritances that we have seen both locally, nationally, and at global level, and how all of these things have been interacting, and how, not that we've queered the centre, but we've shown that there is no centre to queer, at least to our queer thinking. In terms, when we read the abstracts, we were really struck by the echoes across the very different ways in which people were bringing their critical apparatus to bear on a very diverse set of topics. But in some ways, the abstract which we thought spoke to everyone's presentations and everyone's aspirations was the one submitted by our final speaker, Dimitris Papanikolaou, his paper Remaining Critically Queer and Being Haunted, address, I think, in our minds, the way in which all of us range across media, across temporalities, not just in a simple back and forth manner, not just in a simple anticipatory or speculative or retrospective manner, but in ways which challenge and rework and queer all of these, not just unidirectional, but singular multi-directional trajectories, which conventional linear ways of time thinking encourage us to orient ourselves to kind of like riff a bit on Sarah Ahmed, whose work has been cited throughout the conference. So Dimitris is going to talk to us for maybe 25 minutes, half an hour, which will give us plenty of time to kind of like reflect on what he raises in his paper and the themes of the conference generally, and how we can not just bring this conference together as a singular event, but how we can look forward and think queer epistemicides and the issues and conversation that we've been having, how we can take them into a different kind of like temporality. So Dimitris, thanks, and over to you.
Thank you very much. I will put my presentation PowerPoint in a moment on, but allow me first, if at any point you cannot hear me well, please let me know. Just one of you just shout. And then also apologies for the church that some of you may be able to listen in the background. It's Good Friday here in Athens. Now, in many ways, this is a talk I want to dedicate to Derek, whom I met 16 years ago. It was still the time that in the big conferences we would go and search each other out, seek each other out seek the queer paper and pass each other out in those venues. At those times we did meet, for conferences. And well, putting this together today, I was thinking all those years, all those people we have been with, we've lost. In queer theory, you talk about queer epistemicides. There have also been queericides that we have seen in our countries, in our countries of reference, in Britain, and in many ways, thankfully, more metaphorical, with the targets being very close to us with attacks that we have suffered. So queer theory is still alive. We are still alive, but there are still many fights to give, and many fights we have given. So to all those fights, anyway. I'm trying to put together themes that we have heard, but also share a little bit my own work and thinking and problems I have with a number of issues that you have also already heard from other speakers today. Some of the things you will hear now in other forms have already been mentioned. But let me start with this. The Remaining Critically Queer and Being Haunted is a title I will explain as I go along, and the photograph you see here is also a photograph I will explain as I go along. Some of what I will say today is in the last chapter of this book, which has come out a month ago, even though this is a book in which I tried to understand 10 years of Greek filmmaking during the Greek crisis as a cinema of biopolitics. However, my thinking of biopolitical realism and biopolitics, about which I will say a couple of things, is also in that book. Sorry for the shameful promotion here. So there are three parts in this presentation. The first is called Critically Queer. You may remember that moment with Judith Butler in the beginning of, in the very early years of queer theory, asked everyone to remain critically queer. I'm not sure what this means and still means, and I wanted to go back to that initial moment and that moment of being critically queer while I'm thinking today of the jobs that we still have to do. We heard for 2 days how much there's still to be discussed, and one of the biggest issues that we still have to deal with is to talk about queer history and to do queer history. If 40 years of queer theory have left us with something, and they have left us with a lot, but if they have left us with something really pressing, is the need to dismantle, but also to think the relationship between two distinct assumptions for doing queer history that we saw happening also. We saw being central also in the papers we heard yesterday and today. I normally call them, and this is, you will see there's a certain playfulness here. There are two sort of main drives when we do queer theory, especially at a local level. One drive is this idea that we have always been queer. The other drive, I call it, there have always been gays. And of course, you understand here is this kind of the word gays used as a kind of in the playful but also contradictory way that people may use it. And also you can read here gay, trans, homosexual, no matter what. The idea is that when we do queer history, still today, and that was the case also 40 years ago, we go often with the assumption that there have been queer relationalities that we need to go back, think through, and investigate. We have always been queer also at the local level, yet sometimes, very often, without a concrete sexual identity. And at the same time, there are other projects which basically look for identity, look for the past engagements with certain political moments of assuming sexual identity and gender identity as a political position. For instance, today we heard this marvelous paper about Poland. It's a kind of "they have always been gays" paper. On the other hand, we heard this amazing paper about India. It's a kind of "we have always been queer" paper. And of course, I'm saying this to be polemical. I know that there is so much else going on. And I also know how much we have learned all those 40 years to sort of intertwine these two projects. However, if you go on and check, especially local queer historiographies as they emerge and become stronger and stronger today, you can somehow see those two often intertwining, yet other times engaging in confrontation projects. I have given in the PowerPoint, and those of you who will see it afterwards, a piece which I have written on the basis of Greek queer historiography, where I try to map these two intertwining and sometimes confronting each other projects. Now, my point here, though, is that on the other, we have always been queer and they have always been gays, has to talk to each other. And if anything, it has been the case from the beginning with what queer theory tried to formulate. Sometimes we do tend to forget that, or sometimes it's old story. And I am quoting here old story. But from the beginning, the foundational texts of what became discussed as queer theory insisted on the intertwining of governmentality, shaping, governing bodies, people, types, identities, and at the same time, the possibility of that involuntary inservitude, that reflective indocility that Foucault famously talked about when he gave these lectures on the politics of truth, these famous "What is Critique and What is Enlightenment" lectures. Again, if you see how Butler rewrites Foucault in 2000 in the Raymond Williams lecture, see how much shading there is. Raymond Williams, Foucault, Butler. She goes back to Foucault and thinks again about the ways we have to look at the moment when the subject is being formed and at the same time tries to do something. There is always this unspeakability that is being produced at the very same time that a subject position is being produced. And what's, if there is a future or a truth, and I cannot see the full of the problem with the when you have, let me see if I can, okay, put this over. Oops. Now I can read my PowerPoint properly. She goes back and quotes Foucault, and there is this idea that, you know, if there is a future or a truth, that it will not know nor happen to be, it oversees a domain, critique oversees a domain it would not want to police and is unable to regulate. So in that sense, critique and this whole idea of being critically queer from the beginning comes together with the thinking on governmentality. There is together, and we need to go back and rethink how much intertwined this idea of subject positioning, you call it also identity, was from the beginning with this other idea of the openings for critique. And here is from the same lecture again, this famous moment where Butler says, if there's this art of existence, going back to Foucault, is this moment where the subject is both crafted and crafting. And the line between how it is formed and how it becomes a kind of forming is not easily, if ever, drawn. Now, why this is important for me is because it reminds me exactly of the need still to go back and make these diverse projects of looking for identities in the past and talking about queer fluid moments as intertwined projects. If anything, queer theory tried to tell us from the beginning. And local queer histories and queer retheorization will learn a lot from going back to that idea and seeing how much we have developed it. Now, this is an example I often use with my students when I'm trying to tell them that, yes, we have different subject positions in the past. We have queer moments that we cannot always assume that were identities. And then we have also identity, political moments. How are we gonna see them all together? These are 5 moments of what you could call today, even though not every protagonist of these photographs would say the same thing. Anyway, you could call today trans-queer presence in the Greek public sphere. In the lower middle, you see Mina Orfanou, an actress playing in the film Strela by Panos Koutras in 2009, a very famous film that somehow brought the issue of trans experience in the Greek public sphere for the first time so much. And often I discuss with my students how this particular film made possible for other similar outings in the public sphere. You see here around Mina Orfanou, the trans actress who played Strela in Panos Koutras' film. You see also Betty Vakalidou on her left, who was in the 1970s a trans queer activist, only to not be heard for years. And then after 2009, she also took again a big public presence and spoke about her experience. You see also Paola Revegnotti, another similar figure, again in the 70s, much less heard, and then in 2010 found a new audience. Their identity, as well as the way they describe their political position vis-a-vis queerness, queer identity, trans queer experience actually changed over the year, and their own rethinking of their own history also is interesting. And on the top left, you see Andona, who, to remember also the paper we started with yesterday, one of the first papers, Andona was a figure in the Greek queer 1980s. I'm not sure she would acknowledge gender for him, her. They were a figure who worked in the public lavatories in the central Greek square, legendary queer figure, you could say today, often the object of violent, the victim of huge violence. And that was also, that is one photograph that survives of Andona, and you can see that they also have this bruising in their eyes. So often I was discussing with my students this this film, and we were talking about how newer representations and new political demands actually bring a new historicization and different projects together in a reviewing and genealogization that is always interesting and always brings together new positions. In a sense, what I said, queer and somehow the kind of fluidity of queerness and the political project of identity somehow drafted and redrafted, plotted and replotted. And often I was putting in this lineage Zach Kostopoulos-Akio, whom you see in the last photograph, who somehow in the 2010s spoke very publicly as an HIV and trans drag queen, an activist for LGBTQ rights, and a anti-racist, anti-fascist activist in Athens. So in a sense, especially because Zakostopoulos, who also became known by the name Zakio towards the end of his life, did talk about his affinity with previous and other models of trans-queer experience. I was putting that photograph in that genealogy. In 2018, Zakostopoulos was heavily beaten, killed in the center of Athens in the middle of the day. It made international headlines. It became a huge consciousness rising issue for all of us. It was then that I realized, and this is a PowerPoint that I have made before his death. By the way, he was the pronoun he would go mostly with. I realized at the time that I was talking about projects that intertwine, different projects of queerness or of identity, that intertwine and then make us see different historical moments differently. Often I was saying that this film, from which the photograph below comes, somehow was being haunted by the previous trans queer presences that somehow we hadn't heard and we could hear afterwards. And suddenly I realized that this film was also being haunted by what came afterwards, by killing that came afterwards, but by many other things that came after in that difficult decade after 2009. The rest of what I will say today is dedicated to that feeling of not only having to intertwine identity projects and queer history projects, but also to see how somehow they are haunted by each other. Here you see Zakostopoulos Zakio in a documentary. She was shooting in the last days of their life, and then mass demonstrations the way of their death. This is a collection that we put together 2 years after Zak's death, after for a year organizing events in places where Zak was performing or going in cafes, in small theaters, etc. It's 30 texts, and it's both the events and this book we did acknowledge were being haunted by Zak's presence. In a sense, being critically queer also means being able to see what being haunted is and how different directions this can take. So here goes being haunted. Often in queer history and queer theory, we know this idea of being haunted. We are all being haunted by those who left us, those who died. If Kosowski-Sedgwick says somewhere, every queer life is being haunted by all those teenage suicides, teenage queer suicides. And here is a famous other piece by Didier Ribon called Haunted Lives, where he talks about the ending of Alan Hollinghurst's The Line of Beauty. And then he says, in the final pages of Hollinghurst's novel, the narrator, Nick, realizes that his test will be, his HIV test will be positive, and starts having a hallucination, almost this big epiphany, watching visions of what will happen after him. And watching visions of his friends, of what they will do, of how at some point in the future they will be remembering him. And there, Eribon says, you know what, for all those of us, especially gay men who survived, it's a full generation to which they belong. I have long considered myself to be a survivor, someone who is fortunate enough to have escaped infection. My life is haunted by those whom the disease took away, by those more precisely whom I managed to survive. When I think about those who have passed away and who were writers, I often dream about what they would have published. I try to guess what path their work might have taken. One of my very first books, published 20 years ago, was a biography of Michel Foucault that allowed me to pay tribute to a friend who had disappeared, to his work so abruptly interrupted. And here we must think of his daunting project of the history of sexuality, which remained unfinished. Didier Ribon means. Here is Didier Ribon, the year that Foucault died, with Lévi-Strauss, to see a little bit why he talks like this as well. But the point here is that, he thinks, reading Hollinghurst, he thinks of himself being haunted by all this potential, this queer potential that went away, that is there but is not. Think also about the reference to Foucault, in the sense that Foucault's history of sexuality in many ways is itself being haunted, especially the first volume, but also the idea, but all those people in the sexological studies that are there in the archive and somehow speak out through that, speak up through that project. You can think of so many other projects where we have tried to do this hauntology for queer history as our main radical project, the idea that we are haunted by the past. But then again, I've been thinking, if you go back to what actually that Hollinghurst piece says, you might think that there's another type of haunting going on. Not only us being haunted by the past, but if you read Hollinghurst's last page, this coming from the last page of the Line of Beauty, actually what the protagonist says and does is that he also thinks of himself haunting the future. What there will be is this idea of him being absent. And somehow, he says, sometimes, perhaps only sometimes, his friends will perhaps remember him. The emotion was startling. It was a sort of terror made up of emotions from every stage of his short life: weaning, homesickness, envy, and self-pity. See how the past is haunting at the very moment that the present will be haunting the future, is being imagined as haunting the future. But he felt that the self-pity belonged to a larger pity. It was a love of the world that was shockingly unconditional. He stared back at the house and then turned and drifted on. He looked in bewilderment at number 24, the final house with its regalia, etc. It wasn't just this corner, but the fact of a street corner at all that seemed in the light of the moment so beautiful. This unconditional love in the world, especially at that moment when he realized that he himself may become that haunting presence in that future of the world. So haunted by the past, haunting the future has been part of queer life and queer belonging. How about, though, another direction that this can take, being haunted by the future? If you take these lines of thought and go back to very well-known and shared moments of queer experience, queer arts, queer memory shared, you can see exactly that aspect. In a recent video posted online by Anoni, she tells the story of how she was approached by the Facebook media manager who was asking and giving a lot of money to take the copyright for a rendition of I Will Survive and the video that came from the early 1990s. Anoni explains there, and the video with the text is online in the websites in the conference website. Anoni explains there how she immediately realized that how politically problematic that would have been, and decides to put the video online just 2 days before the American elections for free. The video then is a patchwork video that includes, of course, Anoni's a rendition of I Will Survive, but also images and stop frames from her previous career and from those moments in the early 90s where in this huge and collective precarity in New York in small clubs, she would go and present that song. Of course, I Will Survive in 1991 in that context had a slightly different meaning. And this is an amazing video that includes there footage of Chloe Jubilo, a very well-known trans activist in New York, I'm sorry if I mispronounced the name, and HIV/AIDS activist on the phone in her house. Chloe died some years later, succumbing from HIV/AIDS complications. And as we see those images, these dedications start. The song is still on, dedicated to all endangered Black trans lives. Dedicating to the sacred gay people fighting. The word gay here is used in the way I used it in the beginning as a very inclusive and projected category that's there to be questioned, but dedicated to all those lives that are precarious in all those countries. If you see the video, you'll see that they try to do intersectionality even in the way they sort of poster the various dedications. And there comes this phrase: we will be remembered for what we have done and for what we are about to do. And for me, that was kind of, as I was thinking in the last month about haunting and how actually a deep hauntology is there already and should be taken into account in our projects of queer history and theory today. That idea of, as we see here, Anoni putting a video there and trying to push even herself to think not only of how she is being haunted about the demands of that past, and still, and for this reason, cannot sell the rights for this song or has to have a political stance as the one she has. Somehow is pushing everyone to see those videos in that moment and see that moment as also being haunted through the precarity of the moment by its future. In this short and long run, this we will be remembered for what we are about to do is exactly this idea of being haunted by the future that is coming. And if you go back to, once you start thinking of this triple dimension of haunted, haunted by the past, haunting the future and being haunted by the future, you start seeing it everywhere. It is there in this foundational moment where Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick describes how she passed away in this demonstration in 1991. It is one of those texts that introduced this discussion on queer time. I have noted these phrases, we did not only want to demand representation, we were becoming representation. And one has to think here what it means to be in such precarious position, but also in a demanding moment, very aware, very cognizant, very in the center of a biopolitical moment that works against you, but with which you want to do something. You want to somehow craft. And it is that intense biopolitical moment, what Kosofsky described so much with her books, where the HIV/AIDS experience, for instance, is so present, is that intense biopolitical moment that perhaps makes this kind of multiple haunting such a key issue. If you see what Butler more recently said about this idea of performativity of assembly and the idea that through gatherings, the gathering of the ungrievable in public space marks the existence and the demand for livable lives, the demand to live a life prior to death, simply put. This idea of the constituting public that demands life actually comes from a long tradition of thinking through multiple haunting. Because what else is demanding through public, through assembly, livable life than a very lived experience of being haunted, of knowing how one's demands will haunt the future, but also of being haunted by the future in the fact that you demand to be alive in that short future, right? And with the whole pressure that precarity puts in that moment, that is the whole idea that you may also be seeing your death. And this is exactly what it would be finished in 2 or 3 minutes or less. This is exactly what made me go back and see cultural moments, especially recent moments, and especially related to the HIV/AIDS epidemic, where that point was actually made very clear. In the film 128 beatings per minute by Cabillot, which tells the story of the French ACT UP, there is a device that has actually, once you pick it up, you cannot watch the film otherwise. Indeed, if you have the DVD with the French commentary by the director, he talks a lot about this. From the beginning, it becomes very dramatic in the end. A lot of scenes that you see towards the concluding moments of the scene, but quite a long time, not a la Hollywood, you start listening the soundtrack of the next scene. Hence, when the ACT UP is is having an assembly to decide an act, an action they will perform, actually you have started in the soundtrack listening to the next scene. It becomes dramatic in the end with the death of one of the main characters during the death, and this is why it's so brilliantly powerful and awkward, that moment. During the moment of the death, you're ready for a long time, you're listening to the beats of the music with which his comrades will be mourning in the next scene. In many of these scenes, therefore, these scenes are being haunted by what comes next. And this is exactly what I tried to imply as biopolitical realism. Queer lives have been, if it is something that we need to go back and see in history, is how they have been so much the center of biopolitical projects, and still they try to be realistic about it. They try to do something in various ways. And for this reason, and the history of ACT UP shows this so well, for this reason, they turned haunting, as did Anoni in the video that you can watch afterwards and from which I said, they turned haunting in its full queer complexity into a political project. We will be remembered for what we have done and for what we are about to do. If we are to do queer history today, local, global level, we need perhaps to think or try to historicize those moments where people felt like that. Those moments where people felt haunted, where people felt that there were other people like them in the world, and at the same time felt precarious, felt about to die. And then they did something. That was it.
Thank you so much for that, Dimitris. I think it was a fantastic gloss, or Anoni's video was a fantastic gloss on the sophistication of your exploration there. I think it was really important that you actually took us back to the time when of early AIDS activism, and the multiple temporalities of a haunting, which was hope, anticipation, speculation, and dread, and all these different things, some of which have been realized, some of which are still being realized very unevenly on different scales in different places. And tying in very much, very strongly to the questions of activism and the imperative to act, which I think have underpinned a lot of the papers over the last 2 days in very different modalities, in very different ways. And being attentive to the queerness of close reading, which I think is a lesson I certainly took from Sedgwick. And I think we can't read closely enough when it comes to an artist like Anoni and the significance of her gesture, putting that video out into the public domain precisely at that point. But not just a video, which is worth a lot of money, a video like, as you analyze that song, which is so resonant with layers of temporalities and resistance and complicities and acquiescences and other kind of performative gestures. So I think we've got about 15 minutes still for questions for Dimitris, either in chat or live, and also reflections, commentary on the event itself. Oh, Doug Maui is there. Doug.
Hey, Dimitri, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. And it resonated so much for me working on, or having worked on, the early years of AIDS, and exactly the way you talk about hauntings grammar as, you know, retrospective, prospective, and also, you know, just haunting the future. Immediately I thought about, there's a poem by Melvin Dixon in his collection Love's Instruments. He dies, so the poem, the collection itself is published posthumously. And he has a poem called And These Are Just a Few, and it's an inventory poem of all his friends who've died of AIDS. But he closes that poem by saying, this poem is for the living and this poem is for the dead. Remember them, remember me. Now, he's alive, but dying. And it encapsulated exactly the kind of tripartite structure of haunting that you were talking about. My question to you is, so all this to say, I really appreciate it because it struck an immediate chord, your talk, and it struck an immediate chord. But in addition to, like, this is thinking about Blaze's question yesterday about how we arrive at, or the multiple genealogies of queerness. So exactly the way you've mapped out the structure of haunting and precarity, we find that logic also very much applicable to, for instance, African-American cultural production, right? From slave songs who actually willed their death into existence. Or I think about one of Dr. King's last sermons. This isn't the one he gave right the evening before his assassination, where he actually anticipates his own death. But 2 months before, he gives a kind of conventional sermon. And then at the very end, he actually eulogizes his own death. And that same eulogy is played 2 months later on the same dais where his coffin resides. It's exactly, I mean, I could use the terms you talked about, right, to talk about that moment too. So all this to say is, how do we, the genealogy of queer and other genealogies where haunting aligns a much more expansive way of being in the world as kind of disprized citizens?
The short answer is a question: should we? I mean, should we think of them as different, or do we need to talk about the difference or the similarities there? The longer, slightly longer answer, and thank you for the question, is this. I was trying to, my main starting point is, okay, how do we use all this experience that today is so thick once again in order as a historiographical methodology? Can we? And for instance, can we answer back by showing why all those movements actually take from each other and are not afraid to quote directly each other? You know, I Can't Breathe became, also I Can't Breathe is a quotable phrase, which is this most amazing thing. I mean, it becomes like repeated and then comes from one movement to the other, and also on the lips of people who actually die without being able to breathe. And then what does this show? And this is where I was thinking that there are people, populations, and I'm not afraid to use this term, who are at various points in intense biopolitical presence. And of course, the Black community, especially in the US, has been, you know, for centuries in a constant, intense biopolitical presence. This is why it is in those moments that multiple haunting becomes there as a political project. And it happens with queer communities as well. And of course, these intersect. And of course, there can be other communities, and there, of course, multiple haunting is for everyone. Not, you know, but at the same time, I meant this as a moment to appreciate the thickness of haunting in these particular cases we talked about yesterday and today, and of course, the similarities and crossings with other experiences. Just to give just a small, I have learned a lot in the last year from a seminar we co-organized in Athens with the Greek community of HIV positive people, and Greek organization of HIV positive people. It's one of the most amazing experiences, precisely because we're trying to turn this thick experience into a historiographical project of looking back, of trying to retell stories, of doing actual archival research. And for me, that's the question. How do you turn that into a historiographical question and methodology? Derek, we cannot hear you.
Ramsey, sorry, you've got a question.
So I think it's actually a related question. What struck me about thanks so much for the talk, first of all. What struck me about the quotation from Sedgwick you shared with us was, first of all, how resonant it was with Doug Maui's keynote yesterday, this moment when she says, right, the goal was not to have representation, but to give ourselves to be representation. I thought that was very reminiscent of some of the dynamics Doug Maui was describing and asking us to consider. But I was struck by the way you read that slide, that passage, because Sedgwick herself was actually not one of the targeted, she did not belong to one of the targeted populations, right? And that seems interesting to me, not least because it's one thing that makes your return and your suggestion that we return to that moment of 90s queer theorizing so untimely, right? Because this is, this is not quite, she herself problematized, right? She herself wrote about the kind of fraught identification with gay men, cis gay men, and so forth. But I guess I'm just wondering. There's also a critique of Sedgwick within trans studies that I think is important to think about. But it seems to me that you're pushing back a bit against the I don't know how to characterize it. It depends, right? Like it depends where you stand, I suppose, right? Whether it's what we've developed as a sort of squeamishness in relation to gestures that might look like they appropriate the struggles that aren't ours, or if you'd want to characterize that some other way, right? As actually important, right? To not do what it is that she's doing there. So I just wanted to invite you to meditate on or think about that.
And this is
I think it's there just to say, sorry, just to say, because I think it's there in that dedication in Anoni's video too, right? There's something there that resonates. I just wonder what you would want to say.
Okay, that is generations change, and I don't know how Eve is now being read. I mean, for our generation, it was like the Bible, and so we knew all kind of pages by heart. And Derek is here and can tell us. But that piece is the piece which often is being discussed on theorizations of queer time. It reflects on her experience in a demonstration where she passes out because she takes medication for cancer. She has had her second chemotherapy, and of course that is an intense moment for her as well. And there she says that the moment she feels she's kind of at the very last moment, she still can see what's happening around her. She feels as if bodies intertwine, basically, and the skin of she even says that the skin of one became the skin of the other, and all that. And of course, you can read it exactly. You can have the critique you're saying, but she doesn't allow you. Why she doesn't allow you that critique? Because what relates and makes all these people into a people at this moment is a gathering, and this is why I put the quotation from Butler afterwards, is exactly this commonality of haunted and haunting, including by their precarity, which may be their coming death. So she says, and what I found amazing, and I'm sorry I didn't explain it enough, is she says, we did not ask for representation. We did not ask this television channel to put on air a specific program. We were becoming representation, which means that she's aware that the moment survives. She's being haunted by that reproduction of the moment already, and she demands that. And for me, that was what related. It's exactly what then Butler goes back and saying this constitutive polity of assembly. What's the constitutive polity of assembly? I mean, you can put canons and make them disperse immediately, but they have been there, and that moment immediately survives. I mean, it's haunting the immediate afterwards already. That's the constitutive. That's the performativity of it. And I do believe that the HIV/AIDS crisis was constitutive of rethinking that. And of course, it was also a gesture to think of the 40 years of queer theory through the other big moment of this year, the 50 years from the first talk of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, what then was called the HIV/AIDS epidemic. We need to be thinking of queer theory in that respect. We all know how influential it was for queer theory anyway. And it was also a way to remind that too.
Are there any other questions or comments, either for Dimitris or for about the event as a whole? Any ideas, any thoughts that people want to share, pick up on? Just then to stay with Dimitris for a second, I think there's another modality of haunting in Sedgwick's afterlife, which is through her connection and her facilitation of the publication of Gary Fisher's work, which has come back to haunt her memory in a quite different way, and the accusations of cultural appropriation as opposed to cultural facilitation are really unresolved and becoming, they're circular, but they are quite acute at the minute. And I think that's actually something for participants in this context, in our context, in this conference, to actually think about, to what extent institutional power differentials actually haunt what we are able to say and what we choose to do. I think, that is our implication in Michael Rothberg's terms, is something that we need to perhaps reflect on. We don't need to stay here until 6:30, obviously. Ramsey.
Can I say something on this? And sorry, yes, indeed. And decisions are there to haunt us, including those. But since this was such an international conference, I wanted to say something since yesterday morning, how much local the experiences that we have been sharing today have been, but also how much we need to think of the globality of this discussion at the same time. Now, I want to think of this as being haunting and haunted again, but I was thinking yesterday morning that there is this moment when moment when one realizes that one's sexuality, does not conform. That for many of us has been a moment of projected minority globality. This is why I love Sense8. I mean, when I was a kid, I could think there were other people out there like me, and we had a secret connection, but I haven't seen them, and that was global in my mind. At the same time, the experiences that formed in me, including in terms of gender and sexuality, were very local. And I wanted to share this as something that will constantly come to talk back to us as a problem or as a solution. The second thing, because of what you said, it is sometimes difficult to appreciate how different institutional contexts are. And some of us today have it much more easily in terms of our queer theorization, and some others so much more difficult. I mean, there are people out there in the meeting that may have constant abuse, including in their institutional environment. So, in that sense, even what you said, there are hierarchies, but also there are hierarchies even between us, and constant challenges for all of us.
And responsibilities and obligations and promises and aspirations and all sorts. Doug, did you want to come in there? Your hand was up, Doug Maui.
I'm sorry to double dip, but I question for, and to keep people past the hour, but to you, Derek and Ramsey, because I was thinking, and also just the number of Italianists who are participating in the conference, and what it means for such an international queer studies conference to come out of scholars who are in Italian studies. It stood out to me because I've been in other conferences where queer conferences that have come out from different disciplinary formation, but this is the first where the principal, the organizers, but also some brilliant papers that have been given have been by folks who work in Italian studies. And I wonder, maybe now that the conference has come and gone, if you two can reflect on your own disciplinary formation vis-a-vis the queer conference that you've staged.
Ramsey, do you want to go first?
I was going to say I'd let you take that one first.
Okay, I'll take that one first. I'll answer this in two ways, Dag. Thanks for that. The question, it's really interesting. First of all, I want to say that the funding for this conference comes from the IMLR, which is an organisation in London which is tasked with promoting research in modern languages. Italian in the UK is very much a minor language, and part of our desire to do something was simply to promote our own discipline. Subsidiary to that is the fact that Ramsey and I both work in general in the field of queer studies, and we wanted to promote queer studies within modern languages. We also want to promote queer thinking in modern languages to a wider audience, and that was the impetus really behind the topic which we chose for the conference, to kind of like introduce to a wider audience the very straightforward notion that different languages and different cultures have different ways of thinking queerly, but the Anglosphere has been underexposed, resistant, uninterested in engaging with them and being transformed with them. So I think from that perspective, we have been absolutely thrilled by the international response of the speakers. The fact that, as Dimitris was saying, we've had all kind of like local responses to these, certainly not universalizing questions, but questions and issues which have a global, certainly very wide import. On a more biographical note, going back to the early days of, as it was called then, gay theory, then became queer theory in the late 80s and 90s, I've always worked within Italian departments institutionally, but for about a 5-year period when I started to become interested in gay, queer issues as objects of academic research rather than just kind of like personal orientation. I found that there was no audience whatsoever in Italian studies. So I stepped out of that and I worked on AIDS narratives, queer narratives in French, English, and American literatures, because not only was there material there was a small but recognizable readership for my work and people that I could be in dialogue with. Having come back into the Italianist fold, in a sense, I want the work that I've done, the work that a lot of scholars have done, we've heard from some of them here, people like Ramsey, a generation of much younger scholars, much younger than me, to actually have a platform which is more durable than the one that I had. So in a sense, it goes back to Dimitris's kind of like opening anecdote about how we met, how we bonded, how we remained friends, how we worked together over the years, kind of in a kind of constellated isolation, which was great. It's great fun. It's great fun working with Ramsey, as it was great fun working with Dimitris and meeting all sorts of people. But nevertheless, I would like there to be a more solid institutional plank within Italian studies for this kind of queer work, but a more solid institutional plank for pretty much everybody who's participated in this event over the last couple of days and for people like us. So I've got that's my
Italian, right? Not
Sorry?
only for Italian,
Oh God, no, not only
the
for
South
Italian.
Mediterranean, still, Greek studies, the same story and all that. And may I add here, Derek, thank you so much for organizing. Doug, I think you said it yesterday. Sorry if I am sort of stealing your point. The more we talk like this, the more we realize that what we think of as the kind of Anglo queer theory and how Anglo queer theory is, it becomes actually Anglo queer theory becomes very local too, because if you remember the way we used Anglo queer theory today and yesterday, it was in a very localized way, trying to remember the exact anecdotes, trying to talk about our own relationship to certain texts, even the idea of certain theories and the presence perhaps, and it was very localized itself. And
can I just say, I totally agree. And I think two very pragmatic issues around that are to do with access to healthcare and the age of consent. And I think they've got to be dislodged from a normative North American perspective if we're actually to have a more kind of like capacious, a more kind of like flexible engagement with these issues. Sorry, Ramsey.
No, I couldn't have said any of that better than either you or Dimitris did. So just to echo what you've said, and just thank everyone, I suppose, thank everyone for your willingness to be here at such an eventful and in many ways difficult and dystopian time. It gives it gives one hope to be able to get to know new people and their work. And it's really been a pleasure.
Can I just echo that? It's been a total pleasure, and we hope this won't be the last conversation that we're able to have. I think we'll be emailing everyone who has registered for the event just to kind of like give them updates and bits of information. We're going to have an online event with Gurab, who brilliantly participated yesterday in very, very difficult circumstances. He's going to give us an online seminar on his performance work, which will be absolutely brilliant. There's some of that information around that on the website. Can I also say, just to kind of advertise the website even more, that we've added another item to the menu, which is a bookshelf, where we want to kind of like advertise the books, but also the chapters, the articles, the exhibitions, the videos that kind of like queer people that we actually make. And I think we've got 4 items. We've got Dag's book, Demetrius's book, the book of the 3 presenters from French Studies yesterday, and the catalogue, the tape catalogue to Zinile Moholi's work, just as a kind of starter. If anyone's got titles, their own titles, preferably that they would like to advertise, please send them to us, and we'll be really happy to actually promote them in that way. But we really want to develop the website as a kind of semi-curated resource for us, basically.